Chapter 1962. Zhang Yan had previously promised Taoist Xinchang that he would block the intruder when he was sealed. Now that this had happened, he certainly would not sit back and watch. He shifted his gaze to the Taoist in bright clothes. If there was no accident, this person should be the one who had come to spy on him previously and was later forced to retreat by Taoist Zhang Yuan's mana. This time, he dared to come alone, but he did not see any helpers, so he should have something to rely on. He stared at the golden bell for a moment and saw that there was a thin layer of smoke-like dense light lingering on its surface, as if it would slip away from his senses at all times. This was undoubtedly a supreme treasure of fortune. Judging from the aura, this person should be the manifestation of the treasure spirit. The last time he came, this treasure should have been with him if it was formed by symbiosis with him. However, he did not take it out and use it at that time. It was either because he was not confident at that time, or he had hidden more powerful means that he had not used yet. When he thought of this, he changed his mind and split into a shadow, which directly shone into the world. Since his cultivation had not passed the stage of enlightenment, he should not have been able to come here. However, the Tai golden bead was borrowed by Taoist Xinchang and used as the sealing force of this place, so there was a connection between them. This was equivalent to pointing him in the right direction, so he was able to find his way here. However, it was only a shadow that could reach this place. Due to the resistance and rejection of each other's mana, the real body still could not directly pass through. Originally, he wanted to come here to meet Taoist Xinchang and discuss the situation, but when he arrived here, he was surprised to find that the one occupying his body was not Zhengnian, but Xinchang Boy. His thoughts turned and he glanced outside. This person should have seen a treasure spirit coming from the outside, so he turned around and showed himself. If this was the case, then the reason why Taoist Xinchang could successfully suppress the other consciousness in the past was not as he had thought, but because Xinchang Boy himself was willing to retreat. He had once thought about how two consciousnesses could coexist. According to his understanding, when one consciousness appeared, the other consciousness was not completely unaware, and could even connect to the outside world to a certain extent. Otherwise, Taoist Xinchang would not have been able to use the power of the seal to force his way out. But now, he did not have the slightest intention of using the power of the seal, as if there was no trace of him. This was either because his consciousness had fallen into a muddled state, or because he had been suppressed to the point that he could not use the power of the outside world. This situation was probably because Xinchang Boy's consciousness was purer. When a goal emerged in his heart, there was no room for any other distracting thoughts, including Taoist Xinchang's consciousness. Thinking of this, he looked at the seal again and found that at this moment, because there was no one presiding over it, the power of the seal was dissipating bit by bit. Xinchang Boy was trying to break through it. But after a deeper inspection, he was relieved. Now, in addition to Taoist Xinchang's own treasured clothes, there was also the Tai golden bead suppressing above, and it had fallen on the joints. With the two superimposed, the power could be said to be doubled. Even Taoist Xinchang himself would not be able to break out without the help of others. This should be a trick that he had set up to prevent accidents, and he did not expect it to work. He turned his eyes and said to Xinchang Boy, "Taoist friend, you can't get out." Xinchang Boy pointed outside and said, "But that person can come in." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "With Taoist friend Zhang Yuan here, I am afraid it will be difficult for him to come in. Although the person has a treasure of fortune, he may not be able to defeat him." Xinchang Boy said loudly, "There is more than one." He raised his fists high above his head and said seriously, "There are two." Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. It was difficult for an outsider to know the connection between treasure spirits, and that person was originally summoned by Xinchang Boy. If he said that this person had two treasures of fortune, then it was probably true. This also explained why this person dared to come here alone. Taoist Zhang Yuan had been fighting with the person until now, and he had also seen some clues. If the golden bell could shake continuously, Taoist Zhang Yuan would have been defeated long ago. However, it only shook after a while. This should be because he couldn't control this treasure freely. This undoubtedly showed that this object wasn't a magic treasure that he was most proficient in. Although Taoist Zhang Yuan was at a disadvantage, he did not ask for help, which meant that he had some tricks up his sleeves. He thought for a while, but did not rashly join the battle. At this moment, Taoist Zhang Yuan was completely on the defensive as his opponent advanced step by step. But he could not be blamed for not trying his best. Every time his magic power seemed to surpass his opponent's, his opponent would shake the golden bell and make all his efforts go to waste. Fortunately, his strength was actually much higher than his opponent's, so even if his magic power was returned, he could immediately make deductions and increase the level of his magic power, which was enough to maintain the situation. This was actually very disadvantageous for him, because in the battle of spirit refinement, one had to fight purely with magic power. Therefore, the level of magic power one could increase was enough to determine who was stronger. Now that he was repeatedly obstructed while doing this, it was tantamount to making no progress, while his opponent's magic power was increasing layer by layer. It was not very obvious who was stronger now, but once the gap was further widened, his opponent could take advantage of this advantage to crush him in one fell swoop. He knew that he could not stop this under the preconditions, but he was not completely helpless. Due to the limitations of his cultivation, it was impossible for his opponent to increase the level of his magic power in one go. He could only slowly push it to the peak that he could reach, and then burst it out in one go. This meant that his opponent had almost no way to worry about anything else at that time. As long as he could block the attack and then take advantage of the situation to counterattack, he could take advantage of his opponent's unfamiliarity with magic weapons and take back the initiative. In order to achieve this, he must rely on magic weapons. Even though he was someone who sought help from himself, he was a Tao protector, so he'd refined this treasure as well. However, since the battle began until now, he'd been restraining himself because he was waiting for an opportunity to turn defeat into victory. At this moment, Taoist Han's attack was very smooth. He had thought that he would at least have to face two opponents after arriving, but now that the battle had reached this point, he could not help but feel a little surprised that no one had come to help him. However, there was always a vague sense of crisis lingering in his heart. After thinking for a while, he decided that it would be better to take down the person in front of him as soon as possible. Then, it would be much easier to deal with other people if they came. Therefore, with a thought, he sped up the deduction of his magic power. Soon, his magic power rose to an unprecedented level. At this moment, without the slightest hesitation, he exerted all his strength and pushed it toward his opponent. When Taoist Zhang Yuan saw this, he shook his sleeve and saw a white jade person fly out. The person had a delicate face, complete facial features, and wore a Taoist robe on top of her head. She looked somewhat similar to Taoist Zhang Yuan. When Taoist Han's magic power surged up, the jade person only trembled, and fine cracks appeared on her body. However, in the blink of an eye, the cracks were completely healed. Han frowned. He had hoped to overwhelm his opponent in one go, but he did not expect that his attack would be blocked. He snorted and with a thought, the golden bell suddenly shook, and the jade person trembled. Then, they gradually turned illusory and showed signs of returning to the good fortune fragment. Taoist Zhang Yuan did not care about this at all. Taking advantage of the fact that the jade person had attracted all the pressure, he immediately calculated. Relying on his profound cultivation, his magic power suddenly increased, and in the blink of an eye, he leaped to a level where he was almost in a stalemate with Taoist Han. When Taoist Han saw that the advantage he had fought for just now was gone, and that the situation had almost returned to the beginning of the battle, he could not help but feel a little irritated. A treasure spirit of good fortune like him was not like a Taoist cultivator, who first got rid of distracting thoughts and then cultivated step by step in order to obtain the fruit of the way. Instead, he was born with great Weili, so his mood was often easily changed. Just as his state of mind was in turmoil, he suddenly felt a tyrannical magic power suddenly attack him. This magic power originally existed in the void, but it suddenly rose without any warning, which made his heart tremble. Fortunately, he was prepared to face a few opponents this time, so he'd always maintained a trace of vigilance in his heart. Now, he didn't panic. With a thought, a dazzling light flashed on his body, and an exquisite crystal cup floated up. With a shake, all the magic energy vanished without a trace, and it was as if it had never appeared before. When Taoist Zhang Yuan noticed this change, he knew that Zhang Yan had attacked him from behind. His spirits were lifted. Although he had not asked for help, it was undoubtedly good news that Zhang Yan had taken the initiative to attack. Moreover, this time, Zhang Yan's attack was also at the right time, forcing the other hidden treasure out. Taoist Zhang Yuan did not miss this opportunity and immediately pressed forward. Taoist Han hurriedly shook the golden bell and weakened the magic power that was attacking him. Although he had a magic treasure, he was not at a disadvantage, and it could even be said that he could still gain the upper hand if given some time. However, being suppressed like this, his spirit was frustrated, and the battle was no longer as fierce as just now. Just now, Zhang Yan was only controlling the magic power from afar and did not show himself. However, after this move, it was not difficult for Taoist Han to see that the Jade Cup should be his opponent's magic treasure, which could swallow the magic power that was attacking him. If he did not get rid of this thing, it would be useless even if he joined the battle. He thought for a moment and prepared to try a method that he had never used before. When he was in the true Yang stage, he could borrow Bu Su Tian's power, but that was only in the present world. After reaching the refined God stage, perhaps because he had transcended from the present world, there was a barrier between the two, and he could no longer use it. He originally thought that perhaps he would have to wait until he controlled Bu Su Tian to be able to do this. But as he continued to sink into the depths of Bu Su Tian's comprehension, he found that he did not need to do this to borrow a part of the Weili. Bu Su Tian was the essence of creation, so even if he could only borrow a little, it was still a great Weili. With this thought in mind, he immediately sank his mind into it, and with a move of his consciousness, a vast power was drawn out. Chapter 1963. Although Zhang Yan's Fa Li had been absorbed by the Jade Cup, with just this one contact, he had more or less seen through the strengths and weaknesses of this object. Logically speaking, if this treasure was so powerful, wouldn't Daoist Han have already taken it out and suppressed Daoist Zhang Yuan? But if he hadn't made a move, Daoist Han might have hidden until the end. The real reason was that this treasure could only deal with one person's magic power at a time. This was highly possible. Otherwise, when he dissipated the attacking magic power, he could have dissipated Daoist Zhang Yuan's magic power as well. The reason he did not move before was probably because he wanted to save his magic power to deal with unexpected situations. Since it had such a flaw, it wouldn't be difficult to defeat the enemy as long as it targeted this weakness. These thoughts flashed through his mind. At this time, Bushutian's Weili became thicker and thicker under the guidance of his mind. When he felt that his mind had reached its limit, he pushed it toward Daoist Han. To prevent his efforts from being easily absorbed by the Jade Cup, he also stimulated his magic power and pressed it down. Daoist Han was trying to regain the upper hand from Daoist Zhang Yuan, but he didn't ignore the magic power that was attacking him just now. At this moment, he suddenly felt two Weili attacks coming at him. His expression changed, thinking that another person was coming. He'd already seen one of them before, and it was the person who'd clashed with him earlier. However, he couldn't determine the origins of the other mighty force, but it gave him a feeling that it was vast and unstoppable. It was even to the extent that there was an indescribable power within it, causing him to feel a sense of fear that returned to his original self for no reason. He instinctively had a feeling that he absolutely couldn't allow this power to strike him. He hurriedly shook the golden bell to drive back Daoist Zhang Yuan's attack. Then, he mobilized all the magic power in his body and collided with Bushutian's Weili. At the same time, he took out the Jade Cup and absorbed all the magic power sent by Zhang Yan. Upon seeing this, Daoist Zhang Yuan didn't persist in raising his magic power. Instead, he seized the opportunity and rushed forward. Because Daoist Han had done his best to deal with Zhang Yan's attack, he could no longer block Zhang Yan's attack. Therefore, Zhang Yan's attack this time was extremely smooth, and the waves of mana crashed into him. Daoist Han's clothes suddenly flashed, and in the blink of an eye, most of the external force that surged up was eliminated. The Daoist robe he was wearing was not shed by a treasure spirit, but was refined from a good fortune fragment. Normally, It was used to restrain his magic power, and in times of danger, it could also be used to block the magic power of others of the same generation. Now that he had this item, just now, he was able to get through it. But even so, when he was hit by it, his chi was weakened. If the mana released by a spirit refinement cultivator was suppressed to the extreme and continued to be suppressed by the opponent, it would be very difficult for it to spread out. It would only be able to keep itself from collapsing, it wouldn't even be able to move outwards. This was equivalent to losing everything. But this wasn't the worst. If even this couldn't be maintained, then it would fall into eternal silence. But this situation was rare. Although he hadn't reached this step yet, the situation was very bad. He realized that his opponent was much more powerful than he had expected, and he knew that he might not be able to deal with it alone. But he was not willing to retreat just like that. With a thought, a phantom was sent out, and in the blink of an eye, it arrived at the place where Ancestor Yao Han and the others were cultivating. Ancestor Yao Han and the others noticed that he had come again, but they didn't avoid him. Instead, they cupped their fists and greeted him. Daoist Yi Han said in a deep voice, "The last time I came, I already explained the situation. Now, I'm fighting with this generation. The Daoist Zhang that you mentioned is also among them, and it's difficult for me to defeat him alone. I hope that you can help me, and I'll repay you later." Ancestor Yao Han sighed, "I'm afraid we won't be able to do as you wish. That place is the world's stabilizing realm. We can sense what you're talking about, but we can't see it. Our mana is far inferior to this person's, and I'm afraid we won't be able to reach that place." Daoist Yi Han was a little displeased. Previously, he didn't want to force Ancestor Yao Han and the others, but that was because he believed that he had a way to deal with the enemy. But after the battle, he ran into a wall, so he wouldn't allow Daoist Yi Han to refuse. He said, "I have the guidance of a fellow Daoist, and I can lend it to you. It won't be difficult for you to reach that place. Besides, you don't need to enter the world's stabilizing realm in this battle, so you don't have to worry too much." Daoist Yulu laughed and said, "Daoist Yi Han, you're making things too difficult for us. Since the previous battle, we've realized that we don't have enough Daoist Dao. We're currently refining our treasures and comprehending the mysteries. I'm afraid we won't be able to leave. Please forgive us, Daoist Yi Han." Daoist Yi Han frowned. How could he not see through such an obvious excuse? He thought about it and figured out the reason, so he patiently said, "If the three of you are worried about Azure Saint, then there's no need for that. He has already promised me that he won't interfere in this matter." Ancestor Yao Han didn't say anything. Even he himself didn't believe in a promise. Putting himself in the shoes of others, he wouldn't believe them. Moreover, even if Azure Saint didn't interfere and he went over to help, he would only be repaying the favor. He wouldn't get much benefit and would instead attract more enemies. Although he had formed a good relationship with Daoist Yi Han, the other party was a treasure spirit, and it would be impossible for them to walk the same path in the future. When Daoist Yi Han saw that the other party had no intention of responding to his conditions, he knew that they were not going to help him. He looked at them coldly and didn't say anything else. With a flicker of his shadow, he disappeared. Daoist Yu Qiu sighed and said, "I'm afraid we've offended this person this time." Ancestor Yao Han said, "It doesn't matter. I don't have any friendship with this person. Even if I refuse, it won't matter. Besides, even if the one who has karma with me wants to turn against me, it will only be after he's repaid the favor." Daoist Yi Han knew that his plan had failed after his virtual body failed. While he was speaking, he had been forced to endure several rounds of attacks from both sides, and the magic power in his body had been weakened to the lowest level. If he did not retreat in time, he might even be forcefully suppressed by his opponent. Although they might not be able to do anything to him, if his opponent didn't release their magical power to suppress him, he could only be restrained here and not be able to do anything. This was something he couldn't tolerate. He took out the golden bell and the jade cup at the same time to slightly alleviate the surging magical power. Then, he took out a spell, and a stream of chi came to receive him. In just an instant, he turned into a flash of light and escaped with his Dharma treasures. As Zhang Yan watched him leave, he fell into deep thought. Just now, when he was attacking this person, the other party used the jade cup to swallow his magical power. But when he was dealing with Bushutian's Weili, he didn't do so. Instead, he directly used his magical power to attack. This didn't seem wrong because his magical power was released after being deduced from the jade fragment, so it seemed stronger, while Bushutian's power was relatively weaker. But he felt that the problem wasn't that simple. If it was only once, it would be fine. But this happened several times in a row, which was enough to show that the other party didn't want Bushutian's Weili to come into contact with his own treasure of fortune. He couldn't judge the reason for this until he saw the real result. But with the imminent threat of that existence, that person wouldn't give up so easily, so there should be another chance to come into contact with him. At this time, he sensed something and saw Taoist Zhang Yuan's figure appear. He cupped his hands and said, "Thank you for helping me, Taoist friend." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You don't need to thank me, Taoist friend. I promised Taoist friend Xinchang that since the enemy is here, I will help him." After a few more words, because they didn't know how Taoist Xinchang was doing at the moment, they both turned into virtual bodies and entered the realm of tranquility. At this moment, Xinchang boy had already retreated and disappeared. Taoist Xinchang's consciousness once again appeared in front of him. Seeing the two people in front of him, he cupped his hands and said apologetically, "I didn't expect that I would be so careless and almost let that person succeed. It's really my fault." Taoist Zhang Yuan hurriedly said, "How is this Taoist friend's fault? The matter of that consciousness is really unpredictable. Besides, it's thanks to Taoist friend's caution that that person didn't manage to escape." Taoist Xinchang said worriedly, "When that person came out, I was completely ignorant, as if I had completely lost myself. If I don't find a way to suppress this matter, I'm afraid a similar situation will occur again." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "If Taoist friend is worried about this, then you don't have to worry about it." Taoist Xinchang attached great importance to his opinion and said solemnly, "Can Taoist friend advise me?" Zhang Yan said, "Taoist friend, you're too serious. You're just afraid that your consciousness will be taken away by that person. But if that person could really do it, why would he need to summon an outsider here? As for this time's body being taken away, from what Taoist has seen just now, it's just that that person's Tao heart is purer. If Taoist friend is firm and unwavering in your Tao path, then you won't be troubled by this." Taoist Xinchang was silent for a moment before he sighed and said, "Taoist friend, you're right." Then, he fell into deep thought. Zhang Yan knew that he was thinking of a solution, so he didn't disturb him. After bidding farewell to Taoist Zhang Yuan, he dispersed his virtual body and returned his consciousness to his real body. Then, he also began to think about something. After reaching the spirit refinement realm, because spirit refinement cultivators were immortal, no matter how many times he defeated his opponent would always be able to fight back. Even if he won, it would only be a temporary victory, and he couldn't really do anything to his opponent. Unless he could use absolute power to separate his opponent from the real world and completely suppress him into eternal silence. He thought that if he could control Bushutian and borrow most of its power, he might be able to solve this problem. But now, he was still quite far away from this step. Even with his current cultivation, he felt that Bushutian was like a vast and unfathomable ocean. He couldn't see the end of it even if he was drifting on it, let alone stirring up a tide. He thought about it again. Since he couldn't drive his opponent into eternal silence, he could only find a way to restrain him. It didn't need to be too long. As long as he could endure until his cultivation reached the level of understanding, then it would be considered a success. Chapter 1964. Zhang Yan did not come up with this idea out of thin air. When he used the Bushtian Weili to deal with Daoist Han, he felt that he should not just use it as a form of mana. This kind of power was self-contained, but it was also combined into a ball. If it could be separated and fell into the real world, after a long time of life and death, it was likely to turn into a single fragment of good fortune. Therefore, as long as it was controlled properly, it could be used to trap enemies. However, there was one thing that needed to be noted. If others came into contact with Bush Tian for a long time, they might be able to use the Weili here. For example, Daoist Qing Sheng wanted to enter this place to seek shelter. However, Shen Lian believed that Daoist Qing Sheng also had a purpose to explore this place. The more this was the case, the more he could not let Daoist Qing Sheng do as he wished. Although he could borrow a little of the Bush Tian Weili now, it was only a guiding method. He only needed to think about it. If he wanted to completely control it, it would be impossible unless he used his own mana to support the power. This was not desirable, because if he did so, it would become a confrontation between him and the Bush Tian Weili. However, if the borrowed Weili was too small, it would not be of much use. Thinking about this, he began to consider whether to use the magic treasure to help. As long as he refined a magic treasure that could carry the Bush Tian Weili, and used it to guide and trap people with it, it should be possible, and it was relatively simple. Although this would cause him to need a magic treasure for every person he trapped, which was a fragment of good fortune, there were only a few powerful beings in the spirit refinement realm who were enemies with him. Based on the current conditions, it was very feasible. This idea was quickly rejected by him because he had a feeling that he did not need to use this to find a way. Why could the Bush Tian Weili be guided by his mind? As he delved deeper into the mysteries, he understood a little, but he could not completely understand it. For the time being, he could see the Bush Tian as a magnified sea of mind. When his mind moved, waves would appear. However, compared to the Bush Tian, he was too weak, so he could only stir a little. Like a stone falling into the sea, there would always be a splash. The more a cultivator could immerse himself in the Bush Tian, the more profound his cultivation would be, and the bigger the waves he could create. However, this was not without limits. For example, at his current stage, he could not immerse himself because it was very likely that he would be merged into one by the Bush Tian. But if he were to draw out a portion of the mighty energy and transform it into his own energy, then wouldn't he be able to rely on this to draw out even more energy? With this thought, he immediately mobilized a small part of the Bush Tian Weili and transferred his own qi into it. Usually, if a spirit ascension cultivator's wish was directed towards that direction, then the situation would definitely develop towards that direction. If it didn't work out, then it meant that there were many external forces interfering. Logically speaking, as long as this part of the obstruction was overcome, it would not be difficult to achieve his goal. At this moment, under his careful effort, the Weili slowly changed and became more inclined to his qi. However, this change was very small and the process was very slow. If he wanted to succeed, he did not know how long it would take. Instead of relying on this, he might as well rely on his cultivation. However, he was not disappointed because of this. This was only to verify his own idea. Now that it was feasible, he could continue. Thus, his mind sank into the broken jade and tried to deduce how to repel the external forces that were not beneficial to him. After repeated deductions, he found a way to solve most of the obstacles, but there was still a part that remained. Perhaps this was Bush Tian's own imprint, or perhaps he could not overcome it until he truly controlled Bush Tian. However, even if he ignored this, just using the rest was enough for him. His mind withdrew from the broken jade and began to try to assimilate this part of the Weili. This time, his progress was smooth, and the power was gradually changing in the direction he wanted. In other words, after he completed it, he would be able to truly control the Bush Tian Weili. And with this power, he would be able to mobilize even more mighty powers. However, he also understood that because it was not perfect, there were still flaws. If he fought against an enemy and used it, he would have to be careful at all times and use a part of his magic power to suppress it. If he did not restrain this part of the power for a long time, it would return to Bush Tian and return to its original state. Although his magic power was endless, he still had to consider the magic power of other godly refinement cultivators colliding with him. It could be said that his magic power was his external shield. Once the shield was lost, he could only be trampled on by others. The larger the magic power ripple, the more it could protect him. Fortunately, it was not a big problem to retreat a little. Moreover, if it was only for the sake of trapping a capable opponent, then it was completely worth it. Moreover, this part of the flaw, in his mind, could be avoided. He could use the magic treasures as sustenance, and when his magic power receded, he could replace himself to control this part of the power. In doing so, he only needed one magic treasure to control it, and it was far better than using it to refine one magic treasure at a time. However, right now, he did not have any creation fragments. Although there were 2 here, they were left here by Taoist Xinchang and did not belong to him. Since he had not decided to let Bush Tian go, he would definitely not use it. Fortunately, this matter could be solved later. After he assimilated this small part of the Bush Tian Weili and tested it in battle, it would not be too late to think about this. In the following days, he cultivated and tried to control the Bush Tian Weili. Unknowingly, a long time had passed. If he was in the present world, perhaps millions of years had passed. However, if he did not transfer his consciousness to the present world, then it would be meaningless to him. There would only be the birth and death of countless realms, and the rise and fall of magic power between cultivators of the same path. This tranquility was finally broken by an external wave of Dharma power. He could not help but open his eyes. He saw the phantom of Taoist Zhang Yuan coming from outside and bowing to him, saying, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan got up and returned the greeting. He smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, did you come here because fellow Taoist Xinchang has made a decision?" He sensed that there was no collision of magic power in the area suppressed by the Tai golden bead, so there should not be any external enemies. Zhang Yuan came to find him at this moment, most likely to deal with the other consciousness. Taoist Zhang Yuan sighed and said, "Fellow Taoist guessed correctly. Fellow Taoist Xinchang thinks it is better to use your method to split the 2 consciousnesses as soon as possible." Zhang Yan said, "It seems that fellow Taoist has found a treasure embryo to carry it?" Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "Yes. Treasure embryos were unfinished treasures and were only useful to the creation treasure spirit. They were not as eye-catching as the creation fragments, so it was actually easier to find them. However, he had still spent a long time and just now had found one. He bowed again and said, "But I still need fellow Taoists' help. May I invite you to come with me and have a chat?" Zhang Yan nodded his head. Then, he also created a phantom and followed Taoist Zhang Yuan into the world-stabilizing realm. As soon as he entered this place, he found that the scenery was very different from the last time. Originally, there was a stalemate between yin and yang, but now the 2 qis were turbulent. One retreated while the other advanced, and the other advanced while the other retreated. This indicated that the master of this world's Tao heart was not stable. Seeing Zhang Yan arrive, Taoist Xinchang solemnly bowed to him and said, "I'm sorry to trouble fellow Taoist again. I'm really ashamed. After fellow Taoist left, no matter how I think about it, I feel that my Tao heart is not as pure as that person's. If he comes out next time and I still can't stop him, I'm afraid the situation will be bad." Zhang Yan glanced at him and saw that although he looked calm on the surface, there was a hidden worry in his eyes. It was probably because of this that the stable world was so turbulent. In fact, in his opinion, there was no need to be so anxious about this matter. After cutting off the possibility of the treasured embryo from the outside entering, Taoist Xinchang's cultivation would only get higher and higher. Now, the advantage was on their side. Moreover, every time he fought with an enemy, he could benefit from it and learn more from it. This was not necessarily a bad thing. But he could also understand Taoist Xinchang's way of doing things. There was an existence that could seize his body and consciousness at any time. In the past, there was no way to deal with it. Now that there was a way, he had to find a way to get rid of it. Moreover, if he didn't get rid of it, he was afraid that even the stable world would not be able to be maintained. When the seal disappeared, it would be useless to say anything. It seemed that the weakness of the treasure spirit of creation was even greater than he had imagined. He thought for a moment and said, "Fellow Taoist, I already understand what you mean. But fellow Taoist needs to think carefully. If that person obtains the whole body, it may not necessarily be a good thing. If boy Xinchang came out, it would be another trouble. The real body could be said to be both important and unimportant at the same time. It was said to be important because even the mighty people of the spirit refinement realm could only exist with the real body. Just now, he could be considered as an independent individual. Only then could he stand in the void, reflect on the reality and fight against the people of the same generation, so that he would not fall into eternal silence. It was said to be unimportant because the treasure spirit of creation was born after shedding its treasure shell. Moreover, it had its own consciousness. As long as the consciousness was not restrained, it could be molded again no matter what it was. If boy Xinchang obtained the real body, then with his pure Taoist heart, his cultivation and mana would soon surpass Taoist Xinchang. By then, it was very likely that he would go around looking for treasured spirits to devour and take the righteous path that he mentioned. Taoist Xinchang sighed and said, "There's nothing we can do about it. Let's not talk about that person. Last time, when we were attacked by external enemies, although we managed to avoid them, this person will not easily give up. Just looking at that magic treasure, he must have a helper behind him, so we won't be able to avoid them every time." Taoist Zhang Yuan also said, "Today, we invited you here for this matter. As long as fellow Taoist Xinchang can separate that person's consciousness into the treasure fetus, then we can work together to suppress it. Then, we won't have to worry about it coming out and causing trouble." Taoist Xinchang nodded and said, "That's right. If this matter can be solved, I can be free and go out to search for the good fortune fragment without worry." Zhang Yan pondered for a moment and thought of an idea. As soon as the idea came to his mind, he decided to give it a try and said, "I wonder if the two of you can allow I to meet with that person again." Chapter 1965. Taoist Xinchang was slightly surprised by Zhang Yan's words, but he did not ask any questions. After a moment of consideration, he agreed. Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "I'll go and guard the outside." Then he bowed and disappeared. He came back with an illusory body, and his real body was still outside the fixed world. He guessed that Zhang Yan might want to talk about some secret matters, so he made an excuse to leave. Taoist Xinchang apologized to Zhang Yan and said, "Taoist friend, please wait for a moment." After the previous experience, he was very careful about the seal. He would check it almost every moment. Before exchanging the boy of divine powers, he had to make sure that there was no mistake. After checking it, he was finally relieved. He sat down and emptied his mind. The two consciousnesses replaced each other. If one of them fell into a state of stillness, the other would naturally come and seize it. Therefore, after a short while, his body was filled with light. When it dissipated, boy Xinchang had already appeared. Zhang Yan stood with his sleeves behind his back and said, "The person you summoned last time was forced to retreat. What do you plan to do now?" The boy of divine powers said seriously, "He will come again." Zhang Yan said with a smile, "But even if he comes again, he will still be blocked outside. Although I don't know Taoist Xinchang's ability, I can imagine that even if an outsider broke through the seal and came in, he must have a way to stop him. I'm afraid it will be difficult for you." The boy of divine powers grunted and drooped his head. He seemed to be in low spirits. Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Taoist friend, do you know that your brother is preparing to split his consciousness to move you out of your real body and then seal you here? In this way, you will have no way out." When he said this, he saw the fear on the boy of divine powers' face. He knew that he had hit the nail on the head, so he changed the topic and said, "But I have a way. If you are willing to follow it, I can persuade your brother not to do this and even let you come and go as you please." Sealing child divine Chang seemed to have solved a problem for the time being, but it did not mean that the problem would be solved once and for all. Even if the Xinchang Taoist could escape, he would still need to use the two magical weapons to suppress him. However, this was not the end of it. He still needed to be vigilant against the sealing so that the Xinchang Taoist would not escape. What could not be neglected was that the Taoist in brilliant robe would not give up just because child Xinchang had been sealed. He would definitely come back here again. After all, the last time this person had arrived, he could be said to have been completely silent. It was only because boy Xinchang had come out in advance that Taoist Zhang Yuan had noticed something unusual, and this had caused his whereabouts to be exposed. If not for the divine constant boy's warning next time, they might not have been able to discover his arrival. This was a very passive situation. From his point of view, Xinchang boy's mind was pure and his cultivation was profound. He and Xinchang priest were originally from the same source, so they were naturally close. So why did they have to be enemies? If they could convince him to acknowledge their side and join them, then not only would they have one less problem to deal with, but they would also have gained a great combat strength. It was difficult to say whether this would succeed or not, but it was worth a try no matter what. At this moment, he looked down and saw that boy Xinchang was looking at him eagerly after listening to his words. He could not help but smile and said, "Taoist friend, after you have obtained your true body, you must not make things difficult for your elder brother. Can you do that?" Boy Xinchang nodded. Zhang Yan continued, "There are things that can be done and things that cannot be done. If in the future you want to devour the treasure spirit, you must discuss it with us. If we do not allow it, then you cannot go. If you can agree, then I can convince your elder brother not to trap you." Boy Xinchang seemed to be a little wronged and lowered his head. "I understand." Zhang Yan nodded his head slightly. Xinchang boy was pure and honest, he would not lie. If he agreed, then it meant that he agreed. However, he would not pin this matter on just a few words. The reason why he dared to do this was because after he refined a part of Bushtian's Weili, he already had the ability to suppress Boy Xinchang. Even if Boy Xinchang changed his mind in the future, he was confident that he could take him down. He thought for a moment and asked, "Has there been any treasure spirit looking for you recently?" Boy Xinchang shook his head, "No." Zhang Yan changed his mind. Since Boy Xinchang did not feel anything, then the one that was expelled last time should not have made a move. He said, "Then let your elder brother come out, I can tell him about this matter." Boy Xinchang responded and sat down with his knees folded. Qi light appeared around him and the qi dynamic gradually disappeared. After a while, priest Xinchang regained control of his body and returned to his original appearance. He raised his head and asked, "Has Taoist friend seen that person?" "What did he say this time?" Zhang Yan said, "I was about to tell Taoist friend, but this is not a small matter. Why don't we invite Taoist Zhang Yuan back first?" Taoist Xinchang said, "Good." He immediately called out to Taoist Zhang Yuan. Not long after, Taoist Zhang Yuan returned. He could guess that Zhang Yan must have met Boy Xinchang to discuss the matter of splitting his will. Zhang Yan looked at the two and said, "You two, if we only talk about cultivation, that person is above the three of us, but his mind is extremely pure. He has always regarded Taoist Xinchang as his elder brother. Just now, I have observed him carefully. Even when he blocked the foreign treasure spirit last time, he did not have any resentment. Therefore, I think it would be a pity to seal him up. But if he can be controlled well, he will definitely become a great help." Priest Xinchang sighed, "I have also thought about what Taoist friend said, but without any restrictions, I am afraid that he will go back on his word." Taoist Zhang Yuan also said, "You are right, Taoist Xinchang. It is difficult for us to take oaths. If he is released and still goes against me, it will be difficult to deal with him." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Don't worry, I have a way to subdue him. When that person comes out, I can make him follow I's side first, and there will be no need to worry about him." Priest Xinchang was startled. He lowered his head and thought for a while, then said, "I trust Taoist friend's words, but that person's path is different from mine." This, Zhang Yan shook his head and said, "The division of Tao wills does not necessarily have to be a fight to the death. Since there is a great enemy outside, we can still find a reason to coexist. Even if they were to divide their Tao paths, it would still depend on when it would happen. If that invading existence came, then these spirit refinement almighty cultivators would definitely join forces to fight against the enemy. They wouldn't try to seek outside help. What they needed to do now was to find as many allies as possible and not divide themselves into more enemies." Taoist Zhang Yuan pondered for a moment. They had to search for the good fortune fragment, and at the same time, they had to guard against the prying eyes of outsiders. There were too many things that they had to worry about. If Zhang Yan's words were true and they could win over Xinchang boy, it would make up for their shortcomings. Thinking of this, Daoist Zhang Yuan was also inclined to this idea. He asked tentatively, Daoist Zhang, can that person agree to such a condition? Zhang Yan said, I have talked with that person just now, and I have already convinced him. After Daoist Xinchang divides his consciousness into two, as long as he is not sealed, he will be willing to listen to me. Priest Xinchang thought for a while and nodded. If that is the case, then it will be great. Daoist Zhang Yuan said, there's no time to lose. You might as well separate that person's consciousness as soon as possible. Daoist Xinchang nodded and said, then I'll have to trouble the two of you, guardians. Daoist Zhang Yuan returned the greeting and said, rest assured, Daoist Zhang Yuan. Daoist Xinchang sat cross-legged, then took out an object from his sleeve and placed it in front of Zhang Yan. Zhang Yan looked over and saw that the object was shaped like a gourd. There was a lustrous luster on its surface, but it gave off a feeling that it had yet to mature. It was originally an object of nature, but it lacked a bit of spirituality, to the extent that it was incomplete. After sitting in silence for a while, Daoist Xinchang raised his finger and cut his body. In an instant, his body turned into two balls of light. One stayed where it was, while the other floated toward the treasure embryo and disappeared into it. At the same time, in the depths of the void, Daoist Yihan was engrossed in swallowing and spitting out a pearl that was surrounded by a clear light. Suddenly, he sensed something and looked toward a certain boundary. He muttered, this feeling, could it be that something has happened to the treasure spirit that called me? He originally wanted to find out what was going on, but after suffering a big loss last time, he was very afraid of Zhang Yan and the others, especially Bushutian's Weili, who made him feel uneasy. Before obtaining more means, even if an opportunity presented itself, he would not dare to go alone. After staring at it for a while, he collected his thoughts and once again swallowed and spat out the pearl. In the time of meditation, Daoist Xinchang's figure quickly returned to his original appearance, but after all, he had separated a part of his consciousness, so his aura seemed a little weaker. After the ball of light entered the treasure embryo, circles of spiritual light began to flow out from it, and then it was completely engulfed by the brilliance. After a few breaths, it disappeared just now. When all the brilliance faded, Daoist Xinchang stood there and bowed to Daoist Xinchang, saying, greetings, elder brother. Daoist Xinchang sighed. He could feel that the separation of consciousness was very successful, and the reason was that Daoist Xinchang did not resist at all. Obviously, he was really willing to listen to their orders. He reminded, since you have manifested outside, you have also enjoyed the merit of creation. Remember not to be willful and reckless in the future. Daoist Xinchang hummed and puffed out his chest. He said loudly, I will remember. Daoist Xinchang looked around and lamented, this restrictive formation should not exist anymore. With a flick of his sleeve, the whole world dissolved, and the black and white colors faded away. What appeared in front of everyone was the color of mountains and rivers, a beautiful world. Zhang Yan saw the tiny golden pearl fly out and hover in the void. With a thought, it flew into his sleeve. At this moment, Daoist Xinchang stood up. He extended his hand and a Daoist robe appeared on his arm. He said to Zhang Yan, I've said before that if fellow Daoist can help me free myself, I will give you a treasure. Now that I've said it, please accept it. Zhang Yan thought for a while and did not reject the offer. Instead, he reached out his hand and took it. With an extra primordial treasure by his side, he would have a better chance of winning in a fight. Now that he was standing beside Xinchang Daoist, it would be a good thing for him to have his strength increased. He said, since this is done, I will take my leave. If there is anything else, you can come and call me. Daoist Xinchang bowed solemnly and said, take care, my friend. Zhang Yan looked at Daoist boy and said, please come with me, my friend. Daoist boy obediently came up and grabbed a corner of his sleeve. He nodded, and with a thought, he brought Daoist boy away. Chapter 1966. Zhang Yan waited for his consciousness to return to his real body. Xinchang boy was attracted by his qi dynamic and came along with him. He stopped and looked at his surroundings with his eyes wide open. Ever since he gained consciousness, he had been sealed in frozen world. Although he could sense the outside world when his consciousness alternated, this was the first time he came to the void. In fact, there was nothing to see here except for the countless twinkling stars of life and death, and the collision of spiritual power. But he still seemed to be in high spirits. Zhang Yan shook his head and smiled. This boy was indeed a child, so he took care of him and said, "Just now that you have a real body, you can first recover your spiritual power and cultivation. We can talk about other things when your body is complete." Bu Shutian was the key, so he would not let Xinchang boy enter. He would only restrict him to the depths of his own spiritual power. Even if there were any changes, he would be able to react immediately. Xinchang boy grunted and sat down. After a few breaths, several branches slowly grew out of his body. The lower branch quickly propped up a huge lotus leaf with dewdrops rolling back and forth. The branch that grew to the top grew a leaf cover, as if a reed was built. Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. This was because spirit refinement was a constant clash of magical power. Unless one opened up the world sealing technique, everything that was produced in the void silence would only increase the burden on one's body. Normally, no one would do this. However, Xinchang boy's lotus leaf was not formed by himself. It was extracted from the treasure fetus that had not completely fused. It was obvious that after the two fused, the treasure fetus was nourished. Judging from the lotus leaf, the treasure fetus just now saw was not a gourd, but a lotus node. It was just that it had not fully grown, so it looked similar. This meant that there might be more to this thing, but it was broken for some reason. What Taoist Zhang Yuan found was only a part of it. For some reason, he felt that this thing was not simple. He thought about it. Xinchang boy could feel the treasure fetus and treasure spirit outside, so maybe he could also feel where the other broken treasure fetus were. When he thought of this, he turned around and saw boy Xinchang sitting on the lotus leaf with his arms around his knees. He seemed to have fallen asleep. He understood that after Xinchang split his consciousness into two, he was originally one person becoming two. Although there seemed to be no change on the surface, in actual fact, each individual's mana and cultivation had been weakened, and it would take a period of time to recover. At this moment, boy Xinchang was recovering. Likewise, Taoist Xinchang should also be recovering. If enemies were to attack them during this period, they could only rely on Taoist Zhang Yuan and Taoist Zhang Yuan to resist them. He tried to sense it, but there was no obvious sign in his heart. Then there should be no movement nearby. Thereupon he shook his sleeve and took out the Taoist robe. It had originally belonged to Daoist Xinchang. However, logically speaking, ever since Daoist Xinchang's metamorphosis, he no longer had any direct connection to it. If he had even the slightest connection to it, then he could not be considered to have transcended. However, he did not skip the inspection. After carefully examining it for a moment, he sent his mind into it. After straightening out the aura, he tried to deduce it again in his mind to see if there was anything wrong with it. He believed that as long as Taoist Xinchang was not short-sighted, he would not tamper with it. However, things were different now. Since spirit refining cultivators were not bound by oaths, they had to be careful in everything. Moreover, this item was to be used in battle. Sometimes, it was only a small detail that determined the outcome of a battle. Therefore, he would not allow any possible hidden dangers to exist. In his opinion, although he was on the same side as Taoist Xinchang at this moment, it was only because there was an external threat. No one could predict what would happen in the future. Sometimes, the change of friend or foe between spirit refining cultivators was unexpected, so it was necessary to be more cautious. After repeatedly examining it, he cleanly expelled all the residual aura in it. Then, with a thought, he guided a part of the Buxu Tian Weili over. He still remembered that Taoist Han had tried several times to prevent the treasure of fortune in his hand from directly confronting the Weili. However, he did not know why. Now that he had the same thing, he would try to find out what was going on. The Weili came over and poured into the treasure robe, but unexpectedly, nothing strange happened. He thought for a moment and thought of a possibility. He immediately refined the item and became the owner of the treasure. Then, he drove the whaley into it again. This time, he noticed that everywhere this mighty force passed, the vital energy imprint he left behind actually seemed as if it was being washed away by a wave, and it was gradually fading away. After a short moment, it became an ownerless object once more. He calculated again and understood in his heart. The Buksu Tian whaley had the ability to cleanse the treasure of fortune, and it seemed that it could not tolerate any impurities. However, the reason why Taoist Xinchang was afraid of the whaley was not because of this. If the treasure had been repeatedly refined by a cultivator, the aura imprint would not be easily erased. However, it was precisely because of this that it became a threat to the Taoist Xinchang. The Taoist Xinchang was a treasure spirit, so he was afraid that the Buksu Tian whaley would follow the aura imprint and invade his consciousness. This would not cause any direct harm to the Taoist Xinchang, but it could erase his perception of the world. If it was erased too much, there was a possibility that he would fall into eternal silence. Of course, if it really came to that step, he could first cut off the connection and prevent this from happening. However, who would dare to do this in a battle? After understanding this, Zhang Yan knew that he had another killing move in his hands. If the Taoist Xinchang dared to come again, he could try it. With the whaley's cleansing, he no longer had any doubts. He poured his spiritual power and consciousness into the Taoist robe. After a long time, the robe turned into specks of light and finally gathered on his body. At a glance, it was shining with a golden light. With a thought, it turned black. After a brief inspection, he found that there were many uses to this robe. If he wanted to, he could naturally restrain his spiritual power and not be discovered by others. However, he would not do this. He had not passed the Jiazhen test and had not opened the stopped world, so the protection of spiritual power was necessary. After sorting everything out, he saw that there was nothing else to look at, so he sat down and his consciousness quickly sank into Bushutian. Under the threat of that existence coming at any time, the spirit refinement cultivators were trying to increase their strength. Under such circumstances, everyone was actually being forced to move forward. If they slacked off even a little bit, they might not even have to wait for that existence to arrive. Their peers would come and deal with them first. It was the same for him. He needed to make the best use of his time to increase his cultivation. At this moment, somewhere in the desolate void, Daoist Yi Han, after a long period of hard work, finally swallowing the pearl in his mouth. In the end, it disappeared and a blue light appeared on his body. His entire body was bathed in a dense and clear air. When these phenomena disappeared, he felt that his strength had increased by another level, and he could not help but feel refreshed. At this moment, he had the thought of going to the stopped world, so he tried to sense it, but found that something was wrong. In his senses, the treasure spirit that called him to go seemed to have broken free from the seal and was no longer in the original place. He could not help but think, could it be that after I came last time, that group of people actually let down their guard and let this one escape? After thinking about it, he felt that the possibility was very high. If that's the case, it will be convenient for me to do things. He did everything possible to find boy Xinchang, not to save him, but to devour him. Previously, although he felt that boy Xinchang's cultivation was a level higher than his, he had two supreme treasures of fortune with him. Under the premise that no one else interfered, he thought that he could easily take down the other party. However, the result was not what he wanted. Before he could reach the treasure spirit, he was repelled by the guardian. Now that his cultivation had improved greatly, he had another idea in his mind. Just as he was thinking, he suddenly felt a strand of aura coming towards him. He couldn't help but reveal a look of pleasant surprise. With a thought, he followed that strand of aura. In the blink of an eye, he found himself in a frozen world. However, other than a water mirror, there was nothing else here. He took a step forward, and his body slowly sank into the mirror. After a while, he landed in a cave abode. Above him sat a beautiful female Taoist, dressed in a dark purple Taoist robe. Her hands were placed on her knees. He cupped his hands and said happily, I didn't expect you to come out of seclusion. The female Taoist said in the ethereal spirit language, this time, after refining the drip truth, my cultivation has increased by a level. I still have to thank you for your help last time. Taoist Ihan said, you're being too polite. The female Taoist looked over and said, looking at you, you didn't manage to get the treasure spirit that was sealed, right? Taoist Ihan snorted, and in a resentful tone, he roughly described the situation. In the end, he blamed the failure on ancestor Yao Han. I heard what you said, so I went to look for Taoist Yao Han. However, I came to him twice and even promised him benefits, but he was not willing to help me. I had to go alone, and that was why I couldn't get it. I thought that Yao Han had ulterior motives, and was definitely not willing to repay your favor. The female Taoist said lightly, Yao Han is a scheming person. He must have expected that before he repaid his favor, I will not fall out with him, so he ignored you. It's just that this person is still useful, so don't bother about him now. She thought for a while. Just now, you said that one of the guardian's mana caused you to feel fear? Taoist Ihan revealed a look of fear. Yes, I only felt that the mana contained an inexplicable wailing, which made me tremble in fear. To avoid any accidents, I did not dare to use my treasure to collide with it. The female Taoist's eyes showed a hint of surprise. She raised her hand, pinched her fingers and calculated for a moment, and said, the mana that fellow Taoist mentioned, I can't feel it at all. This is related to my previous deduction, so I should go and take a look. Taoist Ihan's spirit was lifted, and he said happily, could it be that fellow Taoist is willing to help me get the treasure spirit? The female Taoist said calmly, before that person comes, I don't want to make enemies for no reason. Wait until I see the person guarding the gate. If he suits me, then I will let him go. If he doesn't, then I will just take his merit. Chapter 1967. Amidst the silence, the lotus leaf moved a little and then opened up. Boy Shinchang opened up his two small hands and stretched his body. He then rubbed his eyes and looked around. After a while, he revealed a distressed expression and said, I'm hungry. Zhang Yan, who was in a meditative state, noticed that he had woken up. Though the treasured spirits of creation were blessed by the heavens, they were limited by their birth. To improve their cultivation, they could only rely on stealing from their own kind. Therefore, the way to do things was simple. They would steal from their own kind, refine them, and repeat the process. However, the improvement of their cultivation was not enough to reach the heavens in one step. The refining process was very long. It had been a long time since Boy Changxing stole the treasure fetus, so he should have completely refined it. Therefore, he began to search for his next target. He would not purposely stop him. However, he had to decide when and how to do it. He could not let him do whatever he wanted. He said, Friend, did you sense where the person who came last time was? Boy Shinchang grunted and raised his head, that person is coming. Zhang Yan's eyes suddenly turned deep and serene. Earlier, he had also sensed something in his heart. Coupled with what the divine Chang boy had said, the answer was already very clear. A battle was perhaps unavoidable. However, he did not know how many people would come after the previous failure. That Taoist in bright robe was also a treasured spirit. If he could suppress him, then he could hand him over to Boy Changsheng. As for whether or not Boy Changsheng's cultivation would be able to suppress him, there was no need to worry. He had Busu Tian to rely on, so his cultivation would improve even faster. By then, he would be able to use more of Busu Tian's Weili. When he thought up to here, he thought of something and said, Fellow Taoist, your magic power is completely recovered now. I wonder if you can establish the world sealing technique? Boy Changxing nodded, then shook his head. Zhang Yan raised an eyebrow and asked a few more questions. Only then did he realize that it was not that Boy Changxing could not do it, but he was unwilling to do it. Only when he was outside the fixed world could his senses become sharper. Moreover, his consciousness had been sealed inside the fixed world ever since he was born. Therefore, to him, this was a restriction, not a protection. He was not too concerned about this. It was best if boy Shin Chang did not have to stop the world, and he could save a lot of effort. Otherwise, under normal circumstances, he would need to obtain permission to enter the serene world. If he was not careful, he might even hide from him. He said, if that person comes again, I can join forces with you to capture him. That treasure spirit can be your food. Boy Divine Chang's eyes lit up and he nodded. While he was speaking, Zhang Yan suddenly felt a wave of dermic energy fluctuation coming over. Based on its vital energy, it ought to be the Taoist in brilliant clothes, and he was trying to investigate Zhang Yan's ability. This was because once the magic power of the Spirit Ascension cultivators started to clash, some information about each other would be leaked to the other party. This was unavoidable. Fortunately, when his opponents tried to understand him, he would also know some things about them. The only difference here was that the person with a higher cultivation would be able to obtain more information. However, he would not allow the other party to do as he pleased. With a thought, the jade water droplet was activated, slightly concealing himself and many other realms. He had not reached the stage of understanding the truth, so he could not completely conceal himself. However, he could slightly confuse the other party, making it difficult for him to see the truth. After the owner of the dermic energy realized that he could not obtain much information, he gradually faded away until he almost disappeared. Zhang Yan understood that the other party would not make this effort for nothing. If there were no accidents, it would come soon. On the other side, after Taoist Yihan retracted his dermic energy, he confirmed that Zhang Yan was alone. Instantly, he became restless and said to the female Taoist, fellow Taoist, there is only one person on the other side, and the treasure spirit is under his protection. This is a great opportunity. The female Taoist calculated with her heart, but she got many different results. She thought for a while and said, there are many variables here, we cannot be careless. How about this, go to where Yao Han and the others are and ask them to do this. She then sent a message using her divine will. Taoist Yihan was startled, but he did not forget what happened last time. He said angrily, I'm afraid Yao Han will not agree so easily. The female Taoist said lightly, fellow Taoist, just do as I said. Taoist Yihan had no choice but to follow the direction of Yao Han and the others' dermic energy. In a flash, he arrived at the latter's location. Ancestor Yao Han and the others had already sensed his arrival, so they greeted him respectfully. Taoist Yihan casually returned the greeting and said, fellow Taoists, I have already told fellow Taoist Chaoing about what happened last time. At this point, he deliberately stopped and stared coldly at Ancestor Yao Han and the others. As soon as he arrived, he acted as if he was going to punish Ancestor Yao Han, but in the end, he found that Ancestor Yao Han's expression was calm, as if he was not afraid at all. Ancestor Yao Han was not pretending to be calm. If the person behind Taoist Yihan wanted to do anything to them, there was no need for him to say all this. Moreover, they were not treasure spirits, so there was no reason for them to fight each other. It would be fine if the other party could drive them into eternal silence, but since they did not have the ability to do so, it was not wise for them to become enemies. He cupped his hands and said, may I ask what fellow Taoist Chaoing has to say? Is it still about the treasure spirit from last time? Seeing him so calm, Taoist Yihan snorted and said, that's right. This time, fellow Taoist Chaoing will be working with me, and I hope that you can help. Ancestor Yao Han said, do you want us to attack the fixed world with you too? Taoist Yihan said, no, the treasure spirit has been freed and has gone to another place. There is someone guarding it, but we have deduced that if this person is attacked, the fixed world guardian will come to his rescue. This time, we don't need you to do anything, just pretend to attack and hold the fixed world guardian in place. Ancestor Yao Han did not agree immediately and said, then, is this your request, or is it fellow Taoist Chao Ying's idea? Taoist Yihan sneered and said, this is my private request. Whether you will help or not depends on your willingness. Ancestor Yao Han cupped his hands and said, we agree, but I hope that you will not ask us to help for nothing. Taoist Yihan was taken aback. He didn't expect Meng Qi to agree so readily. He snorted and said, I only hope that fellow Taoist doesn't forget what you said when the time comes. With a wave of his sleeve, he turned around and left. Taoist Yu Qiu was puzzled and asked, fellow Taoist Yao Han, since it is Yi Han's request, it has nothing to do with that person? Why did you agree? Forefather Yao Han said, it's different this time. Last time, it was clear that only one person benefited from it. This time, it's clear that fellow Taoist Xiaoying wants it. If I refuse, I won't be giving her face. Taoist Yu Qiu calculated and tried to sense the fluctuations of magic power and said with certainty, the person Yi Han is looking for this time is Taoist Zhang. Taoist Yu Qiu sighed and said, that Taoist Zhang has many tricks up his sleeves. I don't think they will get what they want. Ancestor Yao Han smiled and said, isn't that good? Just now, Bushutian's secret can be hidden, and the others can force out Taoist Zhang's secret on my behalf. After the magic power confrontation, Zhang Yan waited quietly. After a long time, he suddenly opened his eyes and said, it's here. Child God Chang was standing beside him, biting his finger and looking at the depths of the void with anticipation. Not long after, there were specks of light in the silence. A beautiful female Taoist with crimson lips held a glass rui in her hand and stepped on a cloud. The Taoist in bright clothes from last time was by her side. When they got close, the female Taoist bowed and said, greetings, fellow Taoist. Qiaoying greets me. Zhang Yan returned the greeting. Even though the other party's tone was gentle, the pressure from her magic power was very invasive. He nodded and said, so it is fellow Taoist Qiaoying. I don't seem to be friends with you, so why are you here? Qiaoying looked at child God Chang and said, I am here for this fellow Taoist. Even though her gaze was gentle, the invasive intent in the depths of her eyes could not be concealed. Among the treasure spirits of creation, there were very few who were as pure as child God Chang. This made it difficult for them to sense the existence of the same kind. Therefore, it was as difficult for them to find the same kind of existence as it was for Taoist cultivators to find the fragments of creation. However, child God Chang could easily find Taoist Yi Han and summon him. This ability was very important to her. If she could devour him, she would have the same ability. Shen Chang Boy ignored her and just stared at Taoist Yi Han. Zhang Yan smiled and said, as far as I know, fellow Taoist Shen Chang has nothing to do with the two of you. Taoist Yi Han stood up and said loudly, how can you say that we have nothing to do with each other? Earlier, I heard this fellow Taoist's call for help and learned that he was sealed in a certain serene world. That's why I came to look for him, hoping to free him. However, I was forced to retreat by the guards. Although you haven't shown yourself, I know that you're one of the people who tried to stop me. I was too rash earlier, but I came here today to discuss something with you. This fellow Taoist Shen Chang is the same as me, so I hope you can let him go. Zhang Yan said calmly, where fellow Taoist Shen Chang goes is his own business. He looked at child God Chang and said, are you willing to go with them? Child God Chang shook his head vigorously. Taoist Yi Han sneered and said to child God Chang, fellow Taoist Shen Chang, don't be deceived by him. He originally sealed you, but now he has released you. I don't know why, but he wants to make use of your ability. You must not be fooled. We are from the same origin. If you come to me, you can do whatever you want, and no one will. But when he said this, Qiaoying stretched out her hand and stopped him from continuing. Taoist Yi Han was surprised and said, fellow Taoist, what are you? Qiaoying said, this fellow Taoist Shen Chang has a pure mind, we can't hide our intentions from him, there's no need to waste our breath. She looked at Zhang Yan again and said in a serious tone, if we want to fulfill our wish, we still have to discuss Tao skills with this person here. Chapter 1968. Taoist Yi Han saw that Shen Chang Boy was innocent, so he wanted to persuade him to take the initiative to join him. However, Chao Ying's words dispelled his idea. Fortunately, the fight was in line with his wishes. This time, they came prepared. They had arranged their chess pieces in advance, and each of them had a treasure of fate. Among the two opponents, he judged that Daoist Zhang's cultivation level was at most similar to his, so he only needed to guard against the inexplicable Weili from last time. Xinchang Boy, on the other hand, had never experienced a battle, so he was sure to win. Zhang Yan sensed that the other side was about to fight, so he turned to Xinchang Boy and said, "Since you invited him, I'll leave him to you. However, you don't have any treasures with you, so you need to be careful." Xinchang Boy responded with a joyful tone. After receiving the Taoist robe given to Zhang Yan by Taoist priest Xinchang and refining Bushutian's mighty power, he was able to attack and defend at the same time. He believed that he could take on two opponents at the same time, but he did not know the exact details of his opponents, and he did not know if there were only two of them. However, Daoist Yihan was indeed a weak point. After the last fight, he had almost exposed all of his tricks. After such a long time, there shouldn't be too many changes. At most, he would have gained another supreme treasure of fortune. Since Child Xinchang was able to summon this person, he believed that he should be able to defeat his opponent. Even if there were any mistakes, he could make up for it in time. After giving his instructions, he did not wait for his opponent to make a move. Instead, he activated his magic power and pressed it against Chao Ying. Chao Ying was slightly surprised. She did not expect that Zhang Yan would attack without hesitation. When she saw the direction of the magic power, she immediately understood his intention. However, after thinking for a while, she did not forcibly stop him, because it was exactly what she wanted. She thought that Zhang Yan was the real enemy. If he was eliminated, Xinchang Boy would be easy to deal with. After thinking for a while, she said, "I'll take care of this person. You just need to block the other one for me." Daoist Yihan was full of confidence and replied, "Leave it to me." Just as they were about to attack, Daoist Zhan Yuan also noticed something. After a brief examination, he knew what was going on. He wanted to help, but Taoist Xinchang still needed someone to protect him, so he hesitated. Xinchang Daoist's cultivation was not as profound as Xinchang Daoist's, and he was the one who took the initiative to separate his consciousness. His strength had not fully recovered, and he was not sure what the other party's real goal was. What if it was just a feint, and the real target was Dingshi? Daoist Xinchang also sensed Daoist Zhan Yuan's hesitation at this moment. He could tell that Daoist Zhan Yuan was hesitating, so he said, "Fellow Daoist, you can go to fellow Daoist Zhang's place to help. What's more, the one who attacked us is a treasure spirit. If my brother is captured and refined by this person, his cultivation will definitely rise to a higher level. When that happens, he will definitely come looking for me." When Daoist Zhan Yuan heard this, he cupped his hands and said, "Fellow Daoist, please be careful." He left his ethereal body here, and with a turn of his consciousness, he returned to his real body. Just as he was about to rush over to help, he suddenly felt an aura descend upon him. Then, 3 streams of mana were drawn over, and in an instant, 3 Taoists landed in front of him. Daoist Zhan Yuan's expression froze. He looked over and recognized the 3 patriarchs. He asked coldly, "What do you want?" Patriarch Xiaohan cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Daoist. We came here on someone's request, and we don't want to fight with you. If you stay here and don't move, it will be a good thing for both of us." Daoist Zhan Yuan frowned. Even if he could defeat the 3 Daoists, he couldn't capture them. Moreover, he couldn't just leave for Daoist Xinchang's sake. For the same reason, the 3 Daoists needed to keep him here, and he needed to keep the 3 Daoists here to prevent them from interfering with Zhang Yan. When Patriarch Xiaohan and the other Daoists saw that Daoist Zhan Yuan didn't attack them, they felt slightly relieved. After all, their cultivation and magic power were not as strong as Zhan Yuan's. If Daoist Zhan Yuan insisted on making things difficult for them, even if they could stop him, it would be a strenuous and unrewarding effort. It would be best if they could confront him here. The light in Chao Ying's eyes shifted, and the transcendence energy that was surging towards her from all directions was instantly blocked by her. However, what surprised her was that Zhang Yan's transcendence energy was not the slightest bit weaker than hers. In fact, it was faintly suppressing hers. However, it wasn't easy to determine the winner in a battle of magic power. Relying on her profound cultivation, she began to increase her magic power. Zhang Yan's cultivation was no longer the same as before. At this moment, even if he didn't use the remnant jade to deduce, it wouldn't be difficult for him to keep up with his opponent's pace. Moreover, his opponent was a treasure spirit. Even if his cultivation was higher than his luck might not be as good as his. However, at this moment, he didn't want to overwhelm his opponent in terms of magic power. Even if he could temporarily gain the upper hand, he wouldn't be able to defeat his opponent. Even if he could achieve this, it wouldn't make much sense. His opponent could make a comeback next time. Therefore, he needed to find an opportunity to completely suppress his opponent. In his mind, the strategy he came up with was to try to maintain a stalemate as much as possible. This time, his opponent definitely didn't want to go back empty-handed. In a situation where his attacks were futile, he couldn't help but use his trump card. Once he had a general understanding of this, he would find a way to counterattack. That way, he would have a greater chance of success. Of course, he couldn't go too far and let his opponent see through his intentions at a glance. Therefore, the situation needed to be balanced. At this moment, he paid a little attention to Xinchang Boy and saw that both of them were also in a collision of magic power. Obviously, Daoist Han was no match for his opponent. He took out the golden bell and shook it continuously, repelling the attacking magic power. However, after all, there was a big difference in their cultivation. Without using other magical weapons, he was unable to counterattack. Zhang Yan's mind turned. Looking at Daoist Han's behavior, he didn't seem to be in a hurry to win. He was only responsible for restraining his opponent. There was no doubt that he was waiting for a winner to be decided before deciding whether to advance or retreat. This could not be called a strange plan, but it was considered very stable. Since there were no changes here, he could fight with his opponent with all his strength. Therefore, with a thought, he activated the Tai golden bead. A golden light instantly swayed and hit Chao Ying. When Chao Ying saw the Tai golden bead coming, she did not panic. She swung the glass Rui scepter in her hand and blocked the Tai golden bead. However, under this violent collision, the Rui scepter shattered into pieces. However, she did not care. She gently flicked her wrist and channeled her magic power. The countless pieces merged together and returned to their original appearance. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed slightly. Originally, the Tai golden bead could attack continuously with just a thought. It could often exhaust the opponent's defense, or at least make them flustered for a while. However, this time, because it was restrained by the Rui scepter, it seemed to be stuck in mud. Its attacks could not be connected for a while and it had lost its previous advantage. However, he also saw that although the object could offset any external force and could instantly restore itself even if it was destroyed, it was not a creation treasure. It was only refined from ordinary creation fragments. Its foundation could not be compared to his Tai golden bead. It could be used once or twice, but after dozens or hundreds of collisions, he did not believe that it could withstand it. Even if it could, the opponent would have to pay a considerable price. Thinking to this point, he summoned the treasure back and smashed it down again. Chao Ying was still using the method just now to deal with it. Although she seemed to have the upper hand, she was still extremely cautious. After listening to Taoist Han's words, she was especially concerned about the unknown Weili. Although she did not see Zhang Yan using it, she was sure that he was trying to hide it. Originally, she was prepared to slowly suppress him and it would not be difficult to force him out. However, at this moment, she realized that the opponent's attacks were swift and fierce. If this continued, it would be difficult to create pressure. After thinking for a while, she decided to change her strategy. She turned her eyes and said, "Since you are so persistent, do you think that Taoist Qingsheng will come to help? I have given him an item, which is a promise that he will not interfere in this matter." When Zhang Yan heard this, he laughed in his heart. Chao Ying had learned a lot of things during the previous confrontation of mana. However, she seemed to be mistaken about one thing. Although he had met Taoist Qingsheng once, that was all. He did not have any agreement with him and had never counted on him. Therefore, these words were useless to him. This person had probably fought with the Jade Creation Treasure spirit more often than not and rarely had conflicts with other cultivators. Otherwise, he should know that cultivators like him who had cultivated all the way up had a perfect state of mind. Not to mention that such things did not happen, even if there were, he would not be moved by words at all. This was an unnecessary move. Chowing did not know that a single sentence from her could let Zhang Yan see through so many things. She only noticed that Zhang Yan's state of mind was not the slightest bit affected and did not reveal any flaws. She was a cautious person. She was prepared to take advantage of the situation to launch an attack, but she immediately held back and prepared to look for another opportunity. However, under the repeated attacks of the Tai gold bead, the glass scepter would shatter every time. Although it could still reform, it became weaker and weaker. If this continued, there was a possibility that it would collapse. She had refined this treasure for a long time. She did not want to easily lose it here, so she kept it in her sleeve to be nurtured again. However, without this object, the attacks of the Tai gold bead became swift and fierce. She realized that it was difficult to break through the situation with the current method, so she did not conceal it anymore. She pressed her fingers together and pointed at her hair, and a silver light shot out. When Zhang Yan saw this, his eyes flickered slightly. The treasured robe on his body had not been seen by the other. If he ignored this attack and used the damaged jade to raise his mana and suppress it, then would he be able to seize the opportunity to seal the person in one go? But after thinking about it again, he gave up on this thought. It was not that he had any warning signs in his heart, but from the actions of the other party, he could see that this was an extremely cautious person. It could also be called conservative. Such a person would not neglect his own defense, and would even place it first. He would not allow his opponent to have any defensive treasures on him. If his attack did not hit, he might instead expose his killing move. Thus, he decided to be careful and defend. He flicked his sleeve, and the crystal jade water droplet instantly dissolved and wrapped around his body. But the silver light was mysterious. At this moment, with a flash and a jump, it actually leaped over this layer of barrier and suddenly rushed in front of him. Chapter 1969. Zhang Yan narrowed his eyes when he saw the silver thorn break through the barrier as if it was nothing. He was able to sense that this silver thorn was undoubtedly a supreme treasure of creation. His crystal jade water droplet was refined from a fragment of fortune. Its foundation was the same as his opponent's glass rui. It was expected that it could not block this item. Before he received the Taoist robe, he did not have a supreme treasure of fortune with him. However, he had the Tai golden bead. This item would arrive as soon as it was released. In fact, there was no process. It was just that the mighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm had their mana on the outside. This was also a part of them. Therefore, when this treasure was blasted into the mana, it was blocked. This would give the opponent time to react. However, the silver thorn before him was different. After it was released, it needed to fly over from afar. However, no mana or treasure could block it. Therefore, there must be a mystery here. He did not act rashly. He immediately observed the chi movement and deduced. Soon, he found out what was going on. If this treasure flew towards someone, then that person had to calculate the changes in chi movement before the treasure arrived. If he did not do this, he would definitely be shot and there was no chance of escaping. The mystery was that this treasure was in the pre-celestial state. If one did not calculate it, then it was the same as admitting that this item could hurt him. When facing this item, it all depended on the cultivator's Tao. If one's cultivation was not high enough, or if one was careless, then one would definitely not be able to avoid it. Even if this was not an offensive treasure, not many people could withstand it. After he understood all of this, he quickly deduced the changes in the vital energy within it, and right at the instant he finished deducing it, the object swayed and instantly vanished into nothingness. He knew that this treasure did not really disappear. As long as the master was still there, it would continue to pester him. It would jump out from time to threaten the opponent. Every time he saw it, he had to try to calculate the changes in chi movement. Otherwise, he would still be stabbed by it. However, to fight against the enemy, one had to constantly raise mana. This also required the cultivator to calculate. If he was restrained by this item, then a moment of carelessness could cause him to not be able to keep up with the opponent's changes and lead to defeat. He pondered for a moment, but did not pay too much attention to it. If he didn't have a way to deal with it, he might be caught by it and be restrained. However, he had the jade fragment, so even if he couldn't escape, he wasn't afraid. Moreover, if Bushutian used his Weili, he believed that he could force it to retreat, so he didn't need to worry about it. In the past, Chowing had used this treasure to deal with the treasure spirits of the same kind. This was because even if the treasure spirits had enough cultivation, their temperament was greatly flawed, so they were easily suppressed by Chowing. Even if he could hold on for a while under the effect of this treasure, if the battle dragged on for too long, he would gradually reveal an opening, and it would be very easy for him to obtain it. She originally had great confidence in this, but as the battle progressed, she noticed that Zhang Yan was completely unlike his previous opponents, and he dealt with her with extreme ease. Even though the silver spikes flew out from time to time, they would be easily dealt with by him every single time. Not only that, the changes in his magic power weren't affected in the slightest, and he had never been left behind by her. After a long time, seeing that she still couldn't win, she started to become impatient. Ever since her cultivation had reached a certain level, she had always been successful in her battles, but this time, even though there was no clear winner, she felt that she wouldn't be able to get what she wanted this time. Thinking of this, her attacks unknowingly became more urgent. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. Up until now, he had been following his plan, patiently waiting for an opportunity to attack. Now, he keenly felt that the power of the treasure spirit was fluctuating, and it wasn't as steady as before. This was clearly a sign that the treasure spirit's mind was in a mess. The state of mind of these treasure spirits was more easily shaken than he had expected, and they couldn't keep their cool so quickly. He had a lot of battle experience, and he knew that when a person wanted to achieve a certain goal, but couldn't achieve it, they would most likely speed up their attacks, hoping to break out of the situation as soon as possible. And when they still couldn't achieve anything by doing this, it would be even more urgent, and it would easily disrupt the plan they had made in advance. Just like the Yaohan ancestor and the others, even if their cultivation and Fa Li weren't strong enough, they wouldn't reveal such a flaw. If one wanted to defeat such a person, they could only rely on their own fighting ability. The strong was strong, the weak was weak, and there were no loopholes to exploit. But the enemy in front of him, because of her unstable state of mind, seemed to be weak or strong, and this was a good thing for him. This way, he would be able to seize more opportunities. Zhaoying continued to urge her Fa Li, but the effect wasn't great. The battlefield was the same as before, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't make any progress. She gradually couldn't hold back anymore. But her past battle experience reminded her that she couldn't act recklessly at a time like this, or else it would be even more difficult to win. Relying on this trace of calmness to maintain herself, she tried to restrain herself, and began to wonder if she should give up on Zhang Yan, and turn to Xinchang Boy as her target, and open a gap from there. After having this thought, she began to secretly pay attention. But she soon gave up on this idea, because every time her Fa Li retreated slightly, Zhang Yan's Fa Li would immediately suppress it. If she dared to withdraw, even if she was unharmed, she wouldn't be able to do anything else. Both sides fought like this for a long time, but the battle was still lukewarm, just like the beginning of the battle, and it seemed like it could continue like this. Chowing frowned. Now she was sure that if she didn't use a killing move, then without any external influence, she wouldn't be able to do anything to her opponent. Because her patience had reached its limit, she no longer held back. With a wave of her sleeve, countless tiny flower petals flew out. However, they didn't fly towards Zhang Yan. Instead, they scattered in all directions. Zhang Yan quickly felt the power of this item. The moment the petals touched his Fa Li, it would quickly merge with him. In an instant, he felt as if his Li was under a lot of burden, and the changes in his Li became much slower. During the spirit refinement, the Li collided with each other. However, as long as one hasn't reached the stage of understanding the truth, there was no way to hide it. This treasure made full use of this point. The number of petals seemed endless, which meant that the situation would gradually worsen. If he didn't solve it, then it would reach a point where he couldn't handle it. He immediately understood that this was another problem that needed to be solved. He realized that the treasures that the other party took out were not too powerful, but they were very effective when used in battle. Those who were slightly lacking in cultivation would not be able to deal with them. Fortunately, he was not one of them. On the contrary, deducing and changing was exactly what he was good at. With a thought in his mind, he immediately found the key point. With a jolt of mana, the petals were expelled one by one from the center. Once Chowing started, she didn't stop there. She took out a butterfly ring from her sleeve with 3 fingers. With a flick of her finger, it turned into a living creature, fluttered its wings and flew around. After a short while, it turned into ashes. Then, a worm the size of a grain of rice was born from nothingness. It gradually grew and spun into a cocoon. Not long after, it broke out of the cocoon. After circling around a few times, it turned into ashes again and continued the process. This was a precious treasure that was born from the same body as her, and it was called the butterfly seed. After she underwent metamorphosis, she had carefully refined it, and it could be considered to be the treasure she was most proud of. After this thing experienced a cycle of life and death, it could be said that it had gone through a cycle of reincarnation. After going through 9 cycles of reincarnation, it would be able to transform into a clone that looked exactly like her, and it could even be said to be identical to her Dao arts. At that time, it would be equivalent to having 2 of her on the battlefield. Even though it wouldn't last for long, it would be sufficient for her to defeat her opponent. It wasn't difficult to stop this thing. As long as she suppressed it with her Li before it matured, she could suppress its transformation. However, she didn't have any intention of hiding it. This was because she was using it to increase the pressure on her opponent. If her opponent ignored it, then when the 9 transformations of the magic treasure was completed, there would be another powerful opponent on the battlefield. However, if she was distracted, then she might not be able to deal with the combined attack of the other 2 magic treasures. Zhang Yan observed for a moment and understood the changes. However, he was still calm because this didn't exceed the limit of what he could deal with. It was just that Chao Ying's treasures kept coming out one after another, and he couldn't help but sigh. It didn't matter how strong she was still very wealthy. It had to be said that when he fought with Patriarch Yahan and the others, they had only used 1 treasure each from start to finish. Moreover, he could see that Chao Ying still had protective treasures on her. This time, even if it wasn't a test, he had to take her down no matter what. This way, not only could he get rid of a powerful enemy, but he could also try to return the magic treasures he seized to the good fortune fragment. He changed his mind. At this time, he should show some of his skills. Otherwise, if Chao Ying saw that he could still deal with it calmly, she might retreat out of fear. If that happened, it would be difficult for him to achieve his goal. Last time, when Daoist Yihan was attacked by Bu Su Tian's mighty force and his supernatural power, he had suffered a great loss. He must have told Chao Ying about this, so it was only natural that he would use this method now that he was being pressured. After thinking about it, he directed his mind, and Bu Shutian's Weili was activated. After listening to Daoist Yihan's explanation, Chao Ying had been waiting for the Weili to appear. However, when she felt it now, she was suddenly alarmed. She instinctively didn't want to let the 2 primordial treasures meet with it. She wanted to test the mysteries of this Weili, but in the end, she gave in to her instincts. With a pull of her divine will, she moved the silver thorn and the enchanted butterfly into the depths of her Li. At this moment, Zhang Yan's gaze had instead become sharp. Originally, Chao Ying only had to carefully withdraw her magic treasures one by one, but at this moment, she'd taken both of them back at the same time, and this had instantly removed the pressure on his body. Although this originally wasn't considered to be much to him, this was obviously the opponent's mistake in dealing with it, and she'd revealed an extremely great flaw. How could he let such an opportunity slip by? At that moment, his fa shook, and while she retreated, he suddenly pressed forward. Chapter 1970. In the instant that Zhang Yan pressed down, he had already made a deduction in the remnant of the jade. His magic power rose in an instant, covering Chao Ying's magic power. At the same time, Bushtian's Weili, which was already on the field, suddenly rose. This was a rare opportunity. Usually, when fighting with peers, such an opening was not easy to find. He didn't need to wait for Chao Ying to reveal all her tricks. At this point, the opponent could only leave behind a protective treasure. Even if she had other powerful tricks, once he grasped the initiative, he could deal with them as they came. Just now, when Chao Ying withdrew her magic treasure, she realized that she had made a big mistake. But just now, when Bushtian's Weili came out, that feeling of fear forced her to respond. As a treasure spirit, there were some instincts that she couldn't overcome. Even if she had to do it again, she would most likely make the same choice. With just one mistake, the balance of power was broken, and the situation became worse. The magic power she had put up in front of her collapsed and shrank under the sudden increase in pressure. At this moment, the tiny gold bead, which was patrolling outside, came down again. She had no choice but to raise the glass scepter in her hand to meet it. When the two collided, her hand was empty, and countless fragments flew out. Just now, when the two magic powers were in a stalemate, the tiny gold bead didn't stop bombarding. Under the repeated resistance, the treasure was already on the verge of collapse. This time, it shattered, like the last straw. She moved her mind a few times, and the scattered fragments seemed to be moving in a swamp, unable to mend. But the tiny gold bead didn't stop. Without an obstacle, golden light flashed, and one after another, it came down. Helpless, she could only rely on her own magic power to slightly delay its momentum. However, this moment was different from before. She no longer had the upper hand in the most important aspect of the battle of magic power. Every single attack landed on her body. Fortunately, she had the protection of a treasured robe, so she was barely able to resist a little. However, she was still beaten to the point that her body trembled and her aura fluctuated. This was not the most difficult thing to deal with. The surging magic power from all directions caused the expanding magic power barrier to be constantly squeezed. If it were not for the flying petals there to slightly restrain it, perhaps the speed of its decline would have been even faster. Anyone could see that if this continued, she would soon be forced to a point where she had no way to retreat. At this time, Daoist Han was also paying attention to the situation here, and he was taken aback. Chao Ying had never fallen into such a predicament in the past, and he was a little flustered. His magic power and cultivation were not as good as Xinchang Boy's. This time, he was only responsible for restraining the opponent. Now that his mind was in a mess, it immediately affected the battlefield, and the magic power that he used to fight back was weakened. Fortunately, he had the golden bell to return his magic power, so he wouldn't be defeated immediately. Under Zhang Yan's fierce attacks, Chao Ying only felt that it was getting more and more difficult. Because she didn't dare to let the treasure of creation collide with Bushutian's Weili, her methods were a little constrained. She thought for a while. She still had one or two tricks left, but they might not be able to turn the situation around. She couldn't help but want to retreat. As long as she could leave, there would be another chance. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. He almost immediately felt that his opponent's fighting spirit was shaken. At this time, he naturally wouldn't have any tricks up his sleeves. With a thought, he increased the intensity of his attacks. But at the same time, he was still secretly vigilant. Although his opponent was at a disadvantage, she only wanted to retreat and didn't panic. This was enough to show that she had an escape method that she hadn't used yet. He was considering whether to use Bushutian's Weili now, but after thinking about it, he didn't do so. Right now, he had complete control of the situation. Even if his opponent used a method, he could still deal with it. And if he was at his wit's end, that would be the best. When he suppressed his opponent to the most suitable state, Bushutian's Weili would definitely be able to suppress him. The situation was slipping in an unpredictable direction, but Chao Ying still didn't move. She didn't really lose the ability to fight back. If she used a method, she would be able to escape. It was just that the price of doing so was not small, so she couldn't make a decision. But now, the danger in her heart was getting stronger, and she knew that she couldn't delay any longer. She pointed with 2 fingers, and with a flash of light, a jade cup flew out of thin air. With a turn of the cup's mouth, Zhang Yan's magic power was swallowed. This was originally Taoist Han's item, but to deal with Zhang Yan, he took it and put it on her. Now, it really worked. Then, she threw out the silver spike that she had retracted. This was to block the Tai golden bead so that her mana could be freed. But unexpectedly, when the two collided, she inevitably came into contact with the Bushutian's Weili. She only felt that the imprint of her consciousness attached to the magic treasure was washed away. Although it didn't break away from her, it became heavy and sluggish. What was more amazing was that the force actually invaded her mind. Suddenly, she felt that her body was constantly being worn down, and she couldn't help but be shocked. Zhang Yan had been waiting for the right opportunity. Seeing that she seemed to be in a trance, he no longer hesitated. His qi surged, and he suddenly released the refined Bushutian's Weili. At this moment, Chao Ying's mind trembled, and she felt a great danger descending. It seemed that if she didn't use her method, she wouldn't be able to escape. Her mind turned quickly. Let's get out of here first. When there's a chance, I'll find this person and get back what I owe him today. She immediately made a gesture, and in an instant, she disappeared into thin air. When she reappeared, she was already in Taoist Han's position, and Taoist Han was in her original position. The two of them had actually exchanged positions. Chao Ying's original purpose was to take down Xinchang Boy when Dozhan encountered an obstacle, because as long as he was caught, their purpose would basically be achieved, and it didn't matter whether they defeated Zhang Yan or not. But now it was impossible to do so, so she could only use it to escape. This time, it was not a complete trap for Taoist Han. She understood that with such a change of direction, Zhang Yan would definitely focus his attention on her. In this way, Taoist Han would still have a chance to escape if he was prepared. Of course, if it was really necessary, she would not hesitate to do so. Because she kept Taoist Han by her side, not only because she wanted a helper, but also because she wanted someone who could take the blame for her in a critical moment. Zhang Yan didn't care about Taoist Han. This person was trapped by the Bushutian's Weili and had no way to escape. His eyes turned and found that although Chao Ying was lucky to jump out of the battle circle, under the dense magical power, there was a price to pay. She had almost abandoned all her magical power to protect herself, so at this moment, she was at her weakest. As he thought about it, the Tai golden bead flew up, and with a loud bang, it hit her body. Chao Ying only felt dizzy, and her qi was violently fluctuating. Under the continuous bombardment of this treasure, her mind was shaken, and her magical power could not be used at all. Just a moment later, she felt an unknown force surrounding her, and she felt as if she was sinking into a boundless vortex. She couldn't help but feel a chill in her heart. She gritted her teeth and pointed, and the attached butterfly turned and escaped into the void. At this time, she looked up at Zhang Yan with hatred, and like a bubble, she suddenly disappeared without a trace. Seeing this scene, Zhang Yan couldn't help but be surprised. He thought for a moment and calculated in his heart, and almost guessed the way to escape. This person must have used the method of killing herself, and at the same time, leaving the treasure to escape this disaster. Although it was said to kill herself, but the spirit refinement has long been separated from life and death, and there was no possibility of death. However, if one cut off everything from the present world, then it was the same as disappearing from the void, so this person disappeared. Doing this, there was a high possibility that she would fall into eternal silence. However, she had a creation treasure that was coexisting with her, so she most likely had a method to rely on it, and then return. Otherwise, there was no meaning in doing this. Zhang Yan thought about it. If the butterfly was floating outside, it would definitely be afraid of other treasure spirits, so it was very likely that this thing returned to the world. He had not reached the stage of understanding truth, so he couldn't go to such a place, but there was someone who could, so he turned around and said to Child Xinchang, "Fellow Taoist, can you sense where the butterfly escaped to?" Child Xinchang bit his finger and thought about it, then nodded, "Yes." Zhang Yan nodded slightly, "Then I will have to trouble fellow Taoist I to point out where it went." He absolutely couldn't let go of such a great enemy, otherwise there would be endless troubles in the future. As for Taoist Yihan, he was currently trapped by Bu Shutian's Weili. Although it involved a part of his magic power, once Child Xinchang devoured him, he would be free. At this moment, while Ancestor Yao Han and Taoist Zhang Yuan were confronting each other, they were also paying attention to the changes in the battle situation. When they noticed that Chao Ying had disappeared and Taoist Yihan was trapped, they were all shocked. Since the two were defeated, they knew that there was no point in staying here, so they looked at each other and left without saying a word. At this moment, they also felt a little uneasy, afraid that after Zhang Yan resolved this matter, he would join forces with Taoist Zhang Yuan to cause trouble for them. Taoist Zhang Yuan watched them leave, but he didn't chase after them. Instead, he instantly came to Zhang Yan's side, cupped his hands, and said, "Just now, someone was trying to stop me, so I couldn't come. Please forgive me, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan returned the bow and said with a smile, "What are you talking about, fellow Taoist? If you hadn't restrained those three, I wouldn't have been able to defeat them so easily." He looked at Taoist Yihan and said, "I still have to chase after the person who escaped, so I'll have to trouble fellow Taoist to take care of this place." Taoist Zhang Yuan said in a deep voice, "I'll take care of this place. Fellow Taoist can rest assured." Zhang Yan nodded, then took a step forward and followed the qi movement pointed out by Child Xinchang. After a while, a fixed world appeared in front of him. Chapter 1971. Zhang Yan sized it up. The world of determination was like a solid crystal. It was stagnant and lifeless. He had seen the place where Taoist Xinchang resided, it looked like amber. Even though Xinchang was motionless, there was a bit of spirituality inside. The two of them were both treasure spirits, but there was such a huge difference. This must be because they pursued different Daos. He thought about it in his heart. Chao Ying was someone who sought help from outside. She was able to comprehend the way of truth. Logically speaking, her understanding of Tao should be far beyond her peers. However, when he fought with this person, he did not feel anything like that. Hence, there should be another reason for this. He guessed that this might have something to do with the twin butterfly. This world of determination was not a door to outsiders. Hence, he had to force his way in. With a thought, a golden light flashed. The Tai golden bead was already launched. Instantly, ripples appeared on the world of determination. Chao Ying had not recovered yet. Hence, her resistance was extremely weak. However, he could not rule out the possibility that she was pretending to be weak to lure him in. This was because in the world of determination, one's fighting ability would be amplified to the maximum. However, he did not feel any warning signs. This meant that the possibility was low. If the opponent wanted to kill him, they would have paid a price. Otherwise, they would have used it a long time ago. Moreover, the opponent was only one person left. Moreover, he still had two allies outside. Even if he was trapped inside, he would still have help. When the time came, he could still break the world of determination. After summoning the Tai golden orb, he pressed down on it with his will and dermic powers to wear it down. As he continued to erode it, a crack finally appeared in the world. The world of determination was supposed to exist forever. However, after it was forcefully broken by an external force, if it was not maintained by the master's spiritual energy, then it would flow like a river and gradually die. Seeing that there was an opening to enter, Zhang Yan didn't wait any longer. His body didn't move, but with a thought, he turned into a shadow and entered. This was not to guard against the enemy. He was afraid that if he went in personally, his spiritual energy would fight against the world of determination. This would speed up the collapse of the world of determination. If this caused the treasure to escape again, then it would be even more troublesome to find it again. In a flash, the illusory body arrived at the frozen world. He looked around and saw nothing but a barren plain. There was not a speck of dust, and there was no sun, moon, or stars in the sky. There was no wind or clouds. There was only a clear sky. It was like a frozen picture. Although it seemed to be colored, it was too rigid. He tried to use his senses to make a divination and found that the butterfly had indeed landed here. However, when his will reached the butterfly, it seemed to be frightened and hurriedly hid far away. He looked elsewhere and saw that most of the treasures that Chowing had brought with her just now had returned to this place. At this moment, they were scattered all around and no one went to collect them. Apart from that, there were also a few scattered good fortune fragments. But right now, the butterfly was the most important. There was no doubt that Chao Ying's consciousness was currently attached to it. Before she could reappear, he had to obtain it as soon as possible. Although the treasure was hiding from him, it was useless. In a situation where there was no master, it couldn't even leave this world of determination. It couldn't hide from him at all. With a command in his heart, his figure flashed. In the next moment, he'd already appeared in front of the treasure, and he merely stretched out his hand and grabbed it with ease. A sense of panic came from the treasure. This was the will it had entrusted to Chowing. It was because of this that Chowing was able to return to her original state just now. However, there must have been a price for this, or else it would have taken so long to use it during the battle. Now, as long as he refined this treasure, the treasure's spirit would never be able to return to the void and would only be able to fall into eternal silence. At this moment, a will of submission came from the treasure. It was mixed with a hint of pleading, as if it was begging him to show mercy. Zhang Yan remained unmoved. There was no oath to the spirit refinement realm, so he was merely making a promise to escape. If he really let it go, then he would definitely be in a completely different situation. He would absolutely not allow such a hidden danger to exist. He pondered for a moment before he flicked his sleeve, and all the treasures and fortune fragments that were wandering around here were swept away. After that, he emerged from World Halt, and he swiftly fused with his main body and returned to being one. He opened his palm and looked at the butterfly. In an instant, a ball of clear light leaped up like a flame. Under his gaze, it slowly melted like wax. At the same time, the remnant will on it turned into many images that continuously leapt out. However, as the object slowly melted, the images also gradually dissipated, turning into nothingness in the end. With a wave of his sleeve, Chowing no longer existed. However, this didn't mean that she was dead. There was no such thing as life and death for a spirit refinement realm expert. It was just that without something to entrust her to, she would be driven into eternal silence and would never be able to return to the void. At this moment, the world of determination also melted like ice and headed towards destruction. In just a moment, it completely disappeared. At this moment, he suddenly felt something and turned his gaze to a certain direction. With a faint smile, he moved his feet and returned to where he came from. Taoist Qing Sheng stood in his world of determination. Ever since Chowing came to find him, he had been watching the battle. Previously, he had indeed received an item from Chowing, but he had no intention of keeping his promise. According to his original plan, Zhang Yan would most likely not be able to defeat Chowing and Taoist Yi Han. Thus, he could appear at the most crucial moment and request to release Butian in exchange for saving Zhang Yan. This way, he could achieve his goal ahead of time. However, he never expected that the person who was defeated in this battle would be Chowing. From the looks of it, she seemed to have fallen into eternal silence. Just now, when he saw Zhang Yan's gaze, his heart skipped a beat. He knew that the latter had sensed his gaze. He couldn't help but lower his head and ponder. Originally, he had planned to use the excuse of seeking protection to conspire against Butian, but now he didn't think so. In this battle, it was not difficult to see that Zhang Yan's technique was profound and his methods were brilliant. Now that he had a few allies to help each other, it could be said that he had already gained the upper hand. There was no point in playing these petty tricks anymore. The best strategy was to form a good relationship with Zhang Yan. He couldn't help but rejoice that he hadn't shed all pretense of cordiality with Zhang Yan. He still had a door to communicate with him. However, there was still a problem that needed to be solved. This time, no matter what his plan was, in the end, he didn't lend a helping hand. If it wasn't for Chao Ying's words, it would have been fine. But since he was involved, he needed to go and explain himself. Zhang Yan returned to his original position in the blink of an eye. Daoist Zhang Yuan came to greet him and asked with concern, "Fellow Daoist, how is it?" Zhang Yan replied, "Rest assured, fellow Daoist. That person's item of entrustment has been destroyed by I, so he has fallen into eternal silence. There is no longer any worry of future troubles." Daoist Zhang Yuan heaved a sigh of relief and said, "That's good, that's good." Just now, he had seen that Chao Ying had a lot of magic treasures. If he came again, it would be really troublesome. At this time, Zhang Yan looked at Boy Divine Chang. The latter was biting his finger while staring at Daoist Yi Han, who was surrounded by Bushutian's Weili. But because of Bushutian's Weili, he couldn't enter. He changed his mind. It would have been fine if Daoist Yi Han had been swallowed by Boy Divine Chang. But if Chao Ying had also been swallowed, he didn't know how much her cultivation would have improved. Fortunately, she was already dead, so there was no need to think about it anymore. He said to Boy Divine Chang, "I will leave this person to fellow Daoist. You can do whatever you want. With I here, this power won't stop you." Boy Divine Chang nodded. When Yi Han heard this, he was terrified and shouted, "Can you let me go? Previously, I listened to Chao Ying's orders because of her power. I had no choice. If you are willing to let me go, I can be ordered around by you." Zhang Yan stood with his hands clasped behind his back, ignoring him. Xinchang Boy approached him slowly. Wherever he passed, Bushutian's mighty force did not hinder him at all. However, Daoist Yi Han could not move at all. The fear on his face became more and more intense, but there was a hint of ferocity in the depths of his eyes, as if he had been cornered. Boy Divine Chang quickly arrived in front of him and opened his small hand. Without seeing what he did, Daoist Yi Han turned into a ball of spiritual light and flew into his body. After a treasure spirit was swallowed by its own kind, the primordial essence chi it brought out from the treasure fetus would be lost, and its connection with the world would be completely severed. At that time, it would undoubtedly be thrown into eternal silence. If there was no great fortune, it would never be able to appear in front of many of its peers. Boy Divine Chang swayed a little and yawned. A few lotus leaves appeared on his body, and he lay down on the surface of the leaves. His body was slightly curled up, and it seemed that he had fallen into a deep sleep. Zhang Yan could sense that there were two chi dynamics violently colliding in his body. Although this time it was Boy Divine Chang who took the initiative to swallow Daoist Yi Han, it was also a battle. Whether it could succeed or not, and how far it could go, all depended on its own ability. After seeing the consciousness left by Chao Ying on the magic treasure, he also understood that every time a treasure spirit swallowed its own kind, it had to go through a test. This was also a kind of training for the Tao heart. If it could pass the test perfectly, then its Tao and Dharma power would increase greatly, but if there was a flaw, the harvest would be reduced. The most dangerous situation was to be swallowed by its own kind. Of course, such a situation was not easy to happen. Generally speaking, the one who took the initiative to swallow must be stronger than the other. If it wanted to swallow an elephant, it must be a snake that had the help of an outsider. Although he had helped Boy Divine Chang this time, the latter's Tao was originally higher than Yi Han's, so the possibility of this was not high. At this time, Daoist Zhang Yuan said, "Fellow Daoist Xinchang, I am guarding the place. Since you have nothing to do here, I will take my leave." Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Thank you for coming to help this time." Daoist Zhang Yuan was ashamed. He cupped his hands and bowed, then left. Zhang Yan watched as she left. It was hard to say when the child divine Chang would come out with an answer, so he didn't pay much attention to her. After a moment, he flicked his sleeve, releasing all of the items Ying had left behind. Chapter 1972. Zhang Yan scanned the area. There were not many things floating in front of him, but two of them were shining brightly and shrouded in clear qi. At a glance, he could tell that they were superior to the other treasures. The most eye-catching one was the treasure cup that Chao Ying used to devour mana. In his sight, there was another treasure that was shining brightly. It was the golden bell that Daoist Yi Han used earlier. After he was taken by the god-devourer Chang Tong, no one took it, and it was left floating in the void. These two items were treasures of fortune. The golden bell was born from the same body as Daoist Yi Han, and the treasure cup was different from the two's qi dynamics. If he was not mistaken, it must have been taken from other treasure spirits. These two items were used for defense. If he did not have Bushutian's Weili to restrain him, he might not have been able to take down Chao Ying and Daoist Yi Han. Any deity refinement cultivator with these two magic treasures could greatly increase their combat power. It might be enough to fight against peers of the same generation, but it would not be of much use in front of the existence that was about to arrive. At most, it would only be able to hold on for a little longer. Therefore, there was no need to pay too much attention to them. The key was still Bushutian. If he could control this place, then he could rely on it for protection. He waved his sleeves and kept the two treasures. The remaining magic treasures, such as the silver hairpin, the flower petal, and the Rui scepter, were all refined by Chao Ying using the good fortune fragment. Besides them, there were also 3 good fortune fragments that were taken from the world freeze. Chao Ying should have carried some things with her, but they were taken away with her when she died. At this moment, they should have fallen into eternal silence. He thought for a while and reached out to take the flower petal. It was moist and red, full and beautiful. However, it was not to his liking, and its ability to slow down mana was useless to him. If he had the time, he might as well add more mana to it. Therefore, he rubbed his fingers, and in an instant, the item dissipated. As the splendor bloomed, it returned to the fragment of fortune. Although this Dharma treasure was not ordinary, it was not born in the land of creation like the Tai golden bead. In addition, it did not have a master's consciousness or magical power, so it was very fragile to him and could be easily disposed of. However, he discovered that the fragments that were returned seemed to be a little less than the original ones. With a quick thought, he understood the reason. Ever since the Great Calamity, while the essence of creation had been scattered into countless fragments, it should not have increased or decreased on the whole. Therefore, the portion that was missing had not actually disappeared, but had instead returned to the various realms. He shook his head. No wonder he didn't see any fellow Taoists doing this. No matter how the missing portion changed, it would have nothing to do with him in the end. Moreover, it was very likely that other fellow Taoists would find it. So, it was very likely that doing this would benefit others. Since that was the case, he would rather not do anything. He didn't care about these things. No matter what it was best if it could be used by him. If it wasn't, then it would be meaningless to keep it in his hands. Previously, he had thought of refining a Dharma treasure to replace him in controlling the refined Baksu Weili. However, he didn't have the creation fragment. Now that he had these in his hands, he could do as he pleased. Just one fragment might be a little weak and unable to bear it, but with one more, it would be enough. He looked at the scepter. This thing was also not to his liking. Not only could it be used for defense, but every time it was broken, it needed to be reformed. When used against an enemy, it needed to be controlled. Even just now, the petal was much more useful than it. Therefore, he didn't hesitate. With a flick of his finger, the scepter shattered in an instant. This time, it didn't reform. Instead, it turned into countless sparkling light spots that gathered in his hand and turned into a ball. Looking at it carefully, he found that it was also missing a little. He didn't care. The two fragments combined were enough for him to refine a Dharma treasure. With a serious expression, he poured his consciousness into it. Not long after, the two fragments gradually turned into two halves of the dragon ring jade annulus. Then, he gathered the refined Buksu Whaley and sent it into the jade annulus. The moment the Whaley entered the jade annulus, it was restrained by the Dharma treasure. Not a single strand of it leaked out. He nodded. In this case, he could only release it during the battle, and he would be able to defeat the enemy. With this refined dragon ring jade annulus and the treasures he obtained, it was perfect for both offense and defense. At this moment, he couldn't help but think of Ancestor Yao Han and the others. He wondered if he should kill his way to their door and kill them in one fell swoop. This way, he wouldn't have any trouble in the future. However, when he thought of this, he suddenly felt a sense of danger. He raised his eyebrows and was slightly surprised. Although his magic power and cultivation hadn't increased by much, the techniques he had were much stronger than before. If he fought against Ancestor Yao Han and the others, he wouldn't be able to fight them head-on. But now, it would be difficult for him to win. He tried to divine it but found that it was a complete mess. He couldn't find anything. He pondered for a moment and guessed that there might be some powerful figure behind this junior. However, it was just a thought and he didn't need to do anything to this junior. After all, this junior was not as threatening as Chao Ying. Since it would be troublesome to make a move now, he could put it aside for now. When he could control Buksu Tian and had a place to rely on, it wouldn't be too late to find trouble with them. After making up his mind, he threw these thoughts aside and sank his consciousness into Buksu Tian to continue comprehending the mysteries of the Grand Tao. Just as he thought about it, Ancestor Yao Han and the others felt a sense of danger in their hearts, and their expressions turned cold. Daoist Yu Lu calculated for a moment, then looked at the other two and said, "This should be related to Daoist Zhang." Daoist Yu Qiu guessed, "Could it be that Daoist Zhang wants to take revenge on me after I stopped him from saving him?" As soon as he said this, the three of them looked at each other and realized that it was highly possible. Daoist Yu Lu said solemnly, "If he comes looking for us, I'm afraid we won't be able to stop him." They had seen the entire battle. If Zhang Yan could defeat Chao Ying and Daoist Yu Lu head-on, it wouldn't be difficult for him to defeat the three of them. What made them even more afraid was that Zhang Yan had used some unknown method to trap Daoist Yi Han. If such a method could be used to suppress them, it would be very frightening. Although they weren't treasure spirits and weren't afraid of being devoured, if they were trapped, they would lose the initiative and could only be at the mercy of others. Daoist Yu Qiu sighed. That Daoist Zhang's methods are even stronger than before. He's already so difficult to deal with, and now he's made friends with a few others. If they all attack together, what can we do to stop them? Daoist Yu Lu shook his head. If it's just these people, then it's fine. At worst, we won't get entangled with them. I'm just afraid that those two from Quan Dao will also come to add insult to injury. Patriarch Yao Han's expression was somewhat gloomy. When Daoist Yi Han came looking for them, he had promised to give them some benefits. But in the end, he even died, so the so-called benefits were gone. Now, they, who hadn't done anything, had to bear the consequences. Although they were originally enemies with Zhang Yan, if he hadn't been defeated so quickly, why would Zhang Yan come looking for them first? He said, "Fellow Daoist Yu Lu, are you sure that Chao Ying is no longer here?" Daoist Yu Lu pondered for a moment and said, "In my divination, I haven't found any traces of this person's aura." In the end, he also used the art of sustenance to perish. If this art isn't used well, once the object of sustenance is destroyed, it'll be difficult to return. But it's also possible that he's still drifting around. Daoist Yu Qiu sighed. Regardless of which possibility it was, it seemed that he couldn't block the path for them now. Patriarch Yao Han pondered for a long time and said, "Actually, the two of you don't need to be afraid. Have you forgotten the place we were looking for? As long as we can hide there, we won't have to worry about Daoist Zhang coming for us again." Daoist Yu Qiu hesitated and said, "But that place has an owner. I'm afraid it'll be inappropriate for us to occupy it." Patriarch Yao Han advised, "Ever since the creation essence shattered, that person disappeared long ago. It's very likely that he's fallen into eternal silence. Previously, we were afraid of bearing the karma of that person, so we didn't move. Now that we're taking refuge, we can't worry about such things. Daoist Yulu nodded and said, that's reasonable. This place was originally the place they chose to hide from that existence, but for some reason, they didn't move. Later, when they found clues about Bushutian, they put it aside. Now that it was impossible to seize Bushutian, and danger was imminent, it was better to hide there. Seeing that the two agreed, Daoist Yu Qiu no longer objected. After the three finished their discussion, they immediately began to move. Because there were many places they hadn't explored before, they didn't immediately search for it. Right now, they could only rely on the clues they had collected in the past to slowly move forward. During this process, they didn't encounter any obstruction, which was enough to prove that the owner of that item was no longer here, so it couldn't affect them. After realizing this, they couldn't help but relax. After putting in a lot of effort, the three of them finally found the location. The three didn't waste any time, and with a thought, they arrived in front of an item. This item was oblong, like a mirror-like lake. It was difficult to tell how big it was, and no matter how they looked, they could only see the side facing them. It was like there was an opening in the void. Daoist Yulu said solemnly, it's here. Patriarch Yahan said, in the past, that person didn't even open the world's stabilizing realm, and relied on this item to block many enemies. It shouldn't be a problem for us to use it to avoid that Daoist Zhang. If we manage it well, we can also avoid that person. Daoist Yu Qiu sensed something. Although he didn't feel any danger, he still felt that something was wrong. He said, has no one come here in the past? Patriarch Yahan said, since this item is still here, it means that even if someone found it, they couldn't get it. Since they had found this place, there was no reason to retreat. The three looked at each other and walked toward the mirror-like surface, quickly entering it. But the moment the three entered, the figure of a Taoist slowly appeared on the other side of the mirror-like lake. He looked back, smiled deeply, and disappeared in a flash. Chapter 1973. A strand of Zhang Yan's consciousness was immersed in Bushutian. Every time he felt like he was about to lose himself, he would withdraw in time. However, he also found that as his cultivation increased, the time he could immerse himself in Bushutian increased as well. This meant that his original body could bear more of the mysteries of the Great Path. Even so, the depth of Bushutian was still as difficult to fathom as before. This time, after defeating Chao Ying, he threw in another 3 fragments of good fortune. In addition to what he had before, he now had the number of good fortune fragments on his palm. However, this was like a grain of sand in a vast ocean. For Bushutian, it did not seem to have any effect at all. Because there were no external enemies to disturb him, he was able to meditate for a long time. Gradually, the number of times he went out to meditate decreased. Occasionally, his consciousness would withdraw once. However, when he felt that he had reached the limit of what he could bear, he turned his consciousness back. However, he found that he did not return to his original body. Instead, he was standing in a place that seemed to be empty. He suddenly felt something and looked up. He saw a blurry shadow in front of him. It looked like a Taoist walking with his back facing him. That familiar yet strange appearance was obviously him. However, when he wanted to take a closer look, the person seemed to feel something. He paused for a moment but did not turn back. Instead, he sped up and left. His eyes became deeper and his heart was calm. It was obvious that he had expected this situation. In a trance, the scene shattered and he found himself back on his original body. He thought to himself, just now, that person must be Wan Zhen. He tried to calculate and realized that a long time had passed since he went into closed-door cultivation. Based on how the spiritual energy of the spirit refinement realm fought against each other, if this was in the modern world, it would take billions of years and it would be hard for him to get close to this stage. However, this was a little faster than he expected. Don't look at this small difference. At his level, as long as it was not something that exceeded his ability, then everything could be calculated. Now that there was a deviation, there must be something that he did not calculate and overlooked. He thought for a moment and thought that this might be because the Tao that he was pursuing was different from others. At this time, he suddenly sensed movement outside and looked to the side. The lotus leaves parted and Boy Chang seemed to have woken up. However, he did not seem to be fully awake and was lying on the lotus leaves, unwilling to get up. He thought for a moment. From the looks of it, the outcome of this battle had already been decided, and this person was unsurprisingly the final winner. However, it could be seen that the mass of essence Qi had yet to completely transform into his own. This was normal. Of course. Even the treasure embryo that Boy Chang had secretly swallowed had taken a long time to be completely absorbed. This was normal. Previously, Boy Chang had secretly swallowed it of the treasure embryo of it. This was actually a good thing for him, as he would be well behaved for a long period of time. He retracted his gaze and scanned the surroundings with his consciousness. His eyes flickered. Previously, he had felt that something was wrong with his surroundings, but he didn't pay much attention to it as it didn't affect him. Now that he looked again, he was certain that the magic power of Patriarch Yao Han and the others had disappeared without a trace, and he couldn't feel any of it. This situation was extremely unusual. Even if one of the three of them managed to break through the gate of understanding the truth and hide inside the fixed world, it was impossible for all three of them to hide inside the fixed world at the same time. Since the fixed world accepted outsiders, their magic powers would clash with each other. For example, Daoist Zhang Yuan tried his best to avoid entering Daoist Xinchang's fixed world. He couldn't help but think of the warning that appeared in his heart when he thought of the three of them. Could it be that they really have some kind of relationship with a powerful peer? That's why he sought protection. Or did he find a place similar to Bu Su Tian and hide there? He pondered for a moment. No matter what it was outside of his current abilities. There was no point in delving into it. It was better to focus on cultivation. As long as his cultivation became stronger, there would be a way to solve anything. Moreover, the test of comprehending truth was right in front of him, and there were still some flaws that he had yet to solve, so he needed to plan properly. When a cultivator killed Wang Zhen, it was the same as fighting against another him. Everything that he knew, Wang Zhen also knew. Moreover, because Wang Zhen was reflected from the god's will when he arrived, he could not use any magic treasures that had not been fully refined and were not in the god's will. As for the magic treasures that had been fully refined, he also had the right to control them, so they were not very useful to him. Wang Zhen was even more different. Because he was seeking for himself and for others, it was reasonable to say that his cultivation was higher than Wang Zhen's. Therefore, when the time came, it was very likely that his cultivation was slightly higher than Wang Zhen's. However, there was another possibility, and that was that Wang Zhen's cultivation was slightly higher than his. The reason for this situation was that the path he had taken was much broader than the two mentioned above. In order to obtain more, he had to pay more. Wang Zhen's cultivation would also increase. Just like how he could see Wang Zhen before he reached the gate of understanding the truth, it could be a sign that such a sign would appear. Therefore, even if there was a trace of such a possibility, he had to find a way to be prepared. It should be known that between the real body and the Wang Zhen, there was no difference between their magical powers and methods. Therefore, this slight difference in cultivation might determine the final success or failure. At this moment, he had a feeling that when he really passed this test, some of the doubts that he had in the past might be answered. He pondered for a moment. Now that he was not alone, he could take this opportunity to ask his fellow Taoists. Maybe he could learn some useful principles from them. Thinking of this, he immediately separated a shadow and came to find Daoist Zhang Yuan's qi. Daoist Zhang Yuan did not open the world stabilization technique. His real body was residing in a broken magic tool that looked like a fine house. When he sensed Zhang Yan's visit, he came out to welcome him. He cupped his hands and said with a smile, "It turns out that fellow Daoist has come to visit. Please come in and have a chat." Zhang Yan returned the greeting and followed him into the inner room. After looking around, he sat down at the seat invited by Daoist Zhang Yuan. Taoist Zhang Yuan sighed and said, "This is the magic treasure that I used before I became Taoist. Speaking of which, this is the only thing that I brought out of the present world. I couldn't bear to give it up, so I left it behind." Zhang Yan also sighed. Usually, the present world that the spirit refinement cultivators were born in would eventually collapse one day. Only the present world behind him, because it was connected to Bu Su Tian, the land of creation essence, so it had existed for a long time. Taoist Zhang Yuan exchanged a few words with him and then asked, "I see that you have been cultivating all this time. May I know why you are here today?" Zhang Yan said, "Recently, I saw the change of Wan Zhen and thought that I would pass the realm of understanding the truth. I thought that you had already passed this test, so I came to ask for some advice." Taoist Zhang Yuan was surprised and said, "Fellow Taoist has already reached that stage." Then he thought again and nodded, "It should be. If a cultivator could pass the Wan Zhen, restrain their magic power, and open up the realm of stopping, they would have the ability to protect themselves. However, although this stage was extremely difficult and could be seen as a dangerous path, if one were to look at it from the perspective of realms, it was still within the first stage. Only after crossing it and those who sought external help had enough resources would they have the chance to enter the second stage. It was said that when a cultivator reached this stage, there would be more changes, but he had not reached this stage, so he did not know. He pondered for a moment and sighed, "If you ask me how I passed this test, I can only say that I was very lucky to pass it that day. Now that I think about it, if I tried again, I would most likely be stopped here." He raised his finger and a ball of spiritual light appeared at the tip of his finger and sent it forward. "Everything I have lost and gained is in it." Zhang Yan looked at it and the spiritual light shone into his body. In an instant, he gained all kinds of enlightenment. However, it involved many fighting methods, which were not shown. He understood this very well. If it were him, he would also hide it. The harvest here had already exceeded his expectations. He raised his hand to salute and said, "Thank you, fellow Taoist." Taoist Zhang Yuan shook his head and said, "Everyone's Tao path is different, so I might not be able to help you much." Then, he gave another suggestion, "Now that fellow Taoist Xinchang has returned to his original state, you can go to his place and see more." Zhang Yan nodded slightly. After thanking him again, he said goodbye to Taoist Zhang Yuan and went to Taoist Xinchang's realm of stopping under the guidance of Taoist Xinchang's qi. Just now, he saw the door open, and a spiritual light came out to welcome him. He stepped forward and landed in the world freeze in an instant. He looked around and found that the last time he left, this place had changed greatly. Now, it was even more different. The mountains and rivers were magnificent, and all the stars were present. Except for the fact that there were no living creatures, it was no different from the ordinary world. At this time, Taoist Xinchang appeared in front of him and said, "After I recovered, I wanted to visit fellow Taoist first. However, I saw that fellow Taoist was cultivating, and I was afraid that I would disturb you, so I gave up on the idea. This time, fellow Taoist has come to visit me, so please stay a little longer." Zhang Yan returned the salute and said, "Thank you for your hospitality." However, he noticed that Taoist devotee Constant was very different from the last time he saw him. He was less depressed, and more cheerful and carefree. After splitting his consciousness into two, he had solved one of his problems, so his state of mind had improved a lot. Taoist Xinchang came down and welcomed Zhang Yan to the top of the Dharma pagoda where he cultivated. Zhang Yan chatted with him for a while and said, "Fellow Taoist, you must already know why I'm here." Xinchang Taoist nodded and said with a smile, "The trial of deciphering truth is extremely perilous, and everyone is different. However, there are tricks to it as well, and I was lucky enough to pass the trial with this method." Zhang Yan was slightly surprised. "Oh. I would like to ask." Although Taoist Xinchang's state of mind was not as good as Meng Qi's, he was, after all, gifted by heaven. There were some things that he was born to know, and this was his strength. Taoist Xinchang pointed at himself and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoist, you must know that the Dharma will fade, and so will the mind. Although stubborn truth is born from God, it is still a reflection of my body. At this point, he paused and said, there is something to be done. Chapter 1974. Hearing this, Zhang Yan pondered for a while and immediately understood the meaning behind Taoist Xinchang's words. A cultivator's own qi and qi were not always static. The real situation was like the waves of the ocean. Not only the self, but also the confrontation between the cultivator and the cultivator's qi would also cause the waves to rise and fall. It was just that the waves on the surface of the water would not be able to cause any turbulence in the depths of the ocean. What Taoist Xinchang said about winning the hearts of the cultivators was actually referring to the changes in the hearts of the cultivators. A deity ascension cultivator's mind and qi were one. If the mind died, then the qi would no longer exist, and the cultivator would fall into eternal silence. However, on the other hand, the stronger the qi, the stronger the qi. If the mind was alive, then the qi would naturally rise and fall. It was impossible for it to remain the same. Thinking about this, he was enlightened and asked, fellow Taoist, are you referring to the time when your qi is low and the wanjin appears? That way, you will be able to suppress it. Taoist Xinchang laughed and said, that's right. However, how do you grasp it and when will the wanjin appear? This is especially important. Otherwise, you will hurt yourself. He then exclaimed, fellow Taoist, you know that I am the manifestation of a treasure spirit. I am born with supernatural powers and have yet to gain experience. Therefore, my state of mind is much more unstable than yours. However, when I passed the enlightenment stage, it was because of this that I gained some benefits. Zhang Yan understood. Because Xinchang's state of mind was unstable, his qi would fluctuate and fall. Therefore, his qi would fluctuate. When the wanjin appears, it would only reflect that moment. However, if he was at the moment when his qi was at its weakest, then he would encounter a wanjin whose qi was slightly weaker than his. Do not underestimate such a small difference. If both parties had the same methods and supernatural powers, then the difference of one's qi would be like the difference between heaven and earth. Even if the battle was endless, there would still be hope of winning. There would not be an endless battle. After understanding all this, he also understood that even though this method was dangerous, there was still a trace of heaven's secret that he could climb. However, knowing it was one thing, and doing it was another matter. According to Taoist Xinchang, there was no way to predict when the wanjin would emerge from the spirit. Even he himself did not know. In fact, luck played a part in his success. Once the wanjin appeared, there would be no hope of victory. Therefore, the possibility of failure was not small. He pondered in his heart. What if he could grasp the moment the wanjin's reflection appeared? Thinking up to here, a vague idea appeared in his mind. He raised his hand and bowed, saying, thank you for dispelling my doubts. Xinchang Taoist quickly returned the courtesy and said, Taoist friend, you're being too serious. I'm just going ahead of you, and I dare not be careless. However, the wanjin test is no small matter, and the more prepared you are, the better. I think that you should pay a visit to St. Qing again, and perhaps you might be able to benefit from it. Oh. Zhang Yan reacted immediately and said, Qing Shen was here before. Is it about what happened last time? Xinchang Taoist praised, Taoist friend, your mind is clear. Zhang Yan understood now. Previously, when Zhaoying came to his door, Taoist Qing Shen did not come out to help. Instead, he was suspected of colluding with Zhaoying and Zhaoying. He must be afraid that Zhang Yan would completely close the door to Bu Su Tian, so he wanted to find a way to apologize. However, Zhang Yan happened to be in isolation, so he came to Xinchang Taoist. Xinchang Taoist saw that he was thinking and thought that he had some concerns. He said, Taoist friend, are you afraid that this person will know of your cultivation progress? That is not a problem. Now that my mana has recovered, and with Taoist Zhang Yuan here, he will not dare to act recklessly. Zhang Yan smiled and said, I am not worried about this. Since he asked you to come, he must have no other thoughts for now. Xinchang Taoist said, it is good that Taoist friend can think this way. The most important thing is to pass the test of understanding the truth. If you can pass the test and comprehend it, then the rest can be put aside for the time being. Zhang Yan nodded. He was not worried about this. Judging from Qing Sheng's behavior, he was a person who valued benefits. If he really had a way to suppress Zhang Yan, he would not have come to him with kind words. Now that he had sent out a signal of reconciliation, it meant that he did not intend to use force. Xinchang Daoist's expression turned solemn and said, "Nowadays, there are fewer and fewer people who seek help from others. I hope that Daoist friend Wan will be careful." Zhang Yan knew that he was afraid that he would be replaced by naughty Zhen and that he would have one less person who sought after him. Thus, out of kindness, he reminded him to be careful. Zhang Yan also appreciated this kindness and smiled, "I know what to do. Thank you for reminding me." Since he had gotten what he wanted, he bade farewell to Xinchang Daoist. With a flicker of his shadow, he came out of the stoppable world. Then, he stretched out his hand and a green jade talisman fell into his hand. This was left by Qing Sheng last time, and it could be used to summon him. He activated his mana and a ray of light appeared on the jade talisman. After a while, Qing Sheng's silhouette appeared from the talisman. Qing Sheng took a look at him and bowed, "So it's you who have come out from your seclusion." Zhang Yan smiled and returned the bow. He said, "I have a question today. Daoist Xinchang said that he might be able to get an answer from you. Please forgive me for disturbing you with the talisman." Hearing this, Qing Sheng seemed to have noticed something and could not help but look at him. Even though the latter was just a shadow, he could still sense some clues and said straightforwardly, "What are you talking about? If you have any questions, I'll tell you everything I know." Zhang Yan said straightforwardly, "I am about to reach the stage of understanding the truth. Among the people that I know, only you have the most profound cultivation and you might know the mystery behind it." Qing Sheng's expression became more serious. He said, "I dare not. Previously, when you were besieged, I did not come to help. It was my fault. Since you have asked, I can tell you that I have the right to make up for what I owe." Speaking of which, if Zhang Yan's cultivation improved, it would be detrimental to his plan to take over Busu Tian. However, if he refused this time, he might not be able to seek shelter in Busu Tian anymore, so he had no other choice. Moreover, Zhang Yan could negotiate with others now, but if it was Wan Zhen, who knew if he would have the same thoughts as him? Of course, there was another important reason. Zhang Yan did not hide this matter in front of him, which meant that he was very confident. Maybe he already had the confidence to pass the stage and just wanted to be safe, so he came to ask. If that was the case, there was no need for him to be the bad guy. He could just do him a favor. He paused for a moment and said in a deep voice, "You asked me how to pass the test of stubbornness, but you are wrong about that." Zhang Yan was slightly surprised, "But where did you go wrong?" Qing Sheng looked at him and said, "I did not pass the stage of Wan Zhen. Actually, I am the Wan Zhen that you are talking about." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered. He looked at Qing Sheng and said, "Is that so? Then I would like to ask, how did you defeat the real Wan Zhen?" Qing Sheng actually replaced the real Wan Zhen, which was unexpected. However, the Wan Zhen and the real Wan Zhen were the same. No matter who won or lost, there must be a reason for the winner to win. Qing Sheng stared at him and asked, "Aren't you afraid?" Zhang Yan laughed and said, "I'm not acquainted with the original Taoist Azure Saint. Taoist Azure Saint has his own rules and you're not a crazy person. Why should I be afraid?" Qing Sheng said in a deep voice, "That is not what I meant. I am asking if you are not afraid that you will be taken advantage of by Wan Zhen after listening to my theory of Tao." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You are the one who says it, but I am the one who listens. If I cannot pass this stage, it is because I am not fated, my state of mind is not satisfied, and my cultivation is not strong enough. It is not because of what you said. Moreover, if Wan Zhen replaces me, it means that he is better than me. Wan Zhen is not me, but I am still me. Even if he wins, what is there to be afraid of?" Qing Sheng nodded and said, "Brother, you have your own plans. I apologize for asking too much. He paused for a while and continued, since you are willing to listen, I will not hesitate to tell you. Zhang Yan said, please elaborate. Qing Sheng said in a deep voice, the reason why I can win against the original is not because of any tricks. It is because my Tao is better than his Tao. Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, my Tao, regardless of whether it is Wanzhen or Wanzhen, isn't it all about seeking your own Tao? Qing Sheng said, my Tao is different from his. His state of mind is not stable and he has doubts about seeking his own Tao. He is not as pure as I am. Comparing the two, he is weaker than me. When Zhang Yan heard this, he seemed to understand something. At the same time, he thought of something and asked, since you are a stubborn Taoist, does it mean that you have awakened your consciousness before you appeared, or did you only realize yourself at the moment you were born? He had asked the most important secret of Wanzhen. Qing Sheng was silent for a long time and said, I cannot answer your question. I only know that I know everything about the original. Zhang Yan thought for a while and asked again, if that's the case, how do you know that you're that stubborn? Was it not because he had killed Wanzhen with his true body, causing his mind to change? Qing Sheng said matter-of-factly, this is the difference between me and the original. If I am the original, I might be disturbed. However, my Tao heart is firm. If I do not see all the obstacles, I will not be confused. Zhang Yan nodded. Qing Sheng's Tao heart was indeed pure. Once he had decided on the Tao path, he would not be shaken. Therefore, confusion and self-doubt did not exist in him. If he said that he had decided on it, then it was so. Even if he did not, it would still be the same. Although this was his Tao, Shen Lian could use it as a reference. He bowed and said, thank you for telling me the truth. Qing Sheng bowed and said, recently, I have found a fragment of creation. After you have passed this test, I will pay you a visit. Zhang Yan said no more and returned his consciousness back to his body. He then fell into deep thought. The Xinqiang Taoists started from the state of mind, but the Azure Saint's words went one step further than the Xinqiang Taoists. He started from the Tao. It was as if there were two people in this situation. One was born from the heart, and the other was born from the reflection of the Tao. Thinking about this, Yi Futian's heart skipped a beat as he felt that he had grasped the key.